Good morning, everyone. Wow, I see a lot of familiar faces today, or names. Maggie's here. Haven't seen you, Maggie, in a long time. Madeline. Yeah, lots of people I know. Awesome. Well, welcome, everybody. Good morning. If you feel so inclined to turn your camera on, it does make my experience a little bit better. I'm being selfish there. So if anyone is feeling up for it, I'd love to see real faces when I talk, because otherwise it just feels like I'm talking to myself because I just see a bunch of black boxes with names in them, and that's a little bit harder to engage with. Oh, there we go. Tori, Nikita, sorry, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Now I feel like I'm not all alone. All right, well, welcome everybody. This is our fourth MedPrep, and we are going to talk about personal statements and OChem today. So if you already took the MCAT, feel free to take off after my session, but I assume we're all here today because we want to get going on our personal statement because we're either applying this cycle here in 6 months or we want to just start thinking about it. If you are not applying this cycle in 6 months, I would strongly recommend that you not write your personal statement right now, because truthfully a lot can happen over a short amount of time. And so if you're like a year or a year and a half away from applying, and you go ahead and get it done, it's very possible something might impact your life between now and then it, your personal statement would become obsolete. So we're going to do that in just 1 second. It looks like some people are still trickling in. Before we jump into personal statements, does anyone have any general questions that I could answer for everybody? Is there anyone here today that is new? This is their first MedPrep. You can just post in the chat. Yay, Melissa, welcome. So if anyone here today doesn't know who I am, I'm Joanne. I'm the director of HPA, and I'm joined with Doug, our test prep instructor, and for HPA. And we've been doing MedPrep for, this is our 6th year, I believe, 5th or 6th year. And so it's pretty casual. I really like if people ask questions. I really, really like engagement. One of my favorite things to do for MedPrep is standing in front of the room and just really hearing everybody's stories and perspectives and laughing. And so, to be honest, this Zoom is really challenging for me because I don't get to engage with all of you in the same way. So if I ask a question, feel free to answer it in the chat, or just, and you can, I guess you can't unmute yourself, but
you can raise your hand and I can unmute you if you use the raise hand tool.
There you go. Because with personal statements, as the title of it suggests, it's a very personal process. And so sometimes it does require that we talk a little bit about ourselves and share things about ourselves. And so if anyone is comfortable, then please raise your hand and Doug can unmute you. Dewani asked a question. She said, if we're not applying this cycle, is it a good idea to attend? Yeah, it doesn't hurt. I think it doesn't hurt to start to think about what is going to be expected of you when you go to apply. However, like I said, I wouldn't go and start writing your essay. I wouldn't worry or stress about getting it done anytime soon. I usually recommend that people start working on their personal statement in January of the year that they're going to apply. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about today. All right, I'm going to share my screen and let's do this. Here we go. All right, if you can't see my screen, post in the chat real quick so we can get that fixed. Otherwise, we're gonna get started.
There's another quick question. I thought writing practice personal statements was good.
I'm not sure what you mean by practice personal statements. Writing is great. I have 2 degrees in English. I think writing is always a good thing. I think journaling is a good thing. I think you should write out some of your experiences and start to reflect on them. But I don't know if it's a good use of your time to write an entire essay if you have other things you should be doing. Like if you're in the middle of taking a heavy science coursework, quarter, and you're stressed out and you have a lot of things going on, I don't think you need to prioritize writing your personal statement over studying, if that makes sense. If you just love to write and you want to just write personal statements because it's relaxing to you or you enjoy it, I think that's a great thing. You should do that, but that just means you like to write. When you get to your actual application year, when you're ready to apply in January of that year, you will probably write about 20 drafts of your personal statement, because it takes about that many sometimes to get it to where you want it. And that's perfectly fine. That's why we start so early, because we want to make sure that it's done really, really well. But like I said, things can change a lot over the course of even 6 months. And sometimes really impactful events happen in people's lives, and they go back after that event happened and rewrite their personal statement because their entire perspective has changed. So I wouldn't assume that who you are today is where you're going to be, who you're going to be when you're ready to apply. Does that make sense?
It does.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's get started. So here's just a review of our timeline for those who are in the application cycle. And if you're not in the application cycle, this is what your application year would look like. So we're in January, and this is when you want to start your personal statement. So right now, between now and February, try to make your first appointment with an HPA advisor. It does not have to be me. It can be any HPA advisor. Elizabeth is really good at personal statements. I'd say if you're really struggling with getting things going, you could always make an appointment with Manisha, Brielle, brainstorm ideas. And then I find that Elizabeth's really good at developing the writing part. And so if you're really struggling with kind of forming transitions and kind of putting it all together, I would highly recommend her. And then once you get that draft made and you're like moving on it, you're going to want to just spend time, I would say at least, a couple hours a week revising it. And what that looks like is, printing it out, or, walking away from it, coming back and looking at it with a fresh set of eyes. But when you look at your personal statement, you want to try to look at it through different lenses, through different perspectives, which we'll talk about today. And so February, March, we're going to keep working on it, and we're going to start working on your experience, right? Your experience section, which we talked about last time. By April, you really want to be, wrapping up your writing, because as soon as May hits, your application opens. So AMCAS and ACOMAS opens at the beginning of May. And once your application opens, you're going to be, knee deep in application stuff. You're going to be copying your courses into AMCAS. You're going to be, copying and pasting. You're going to be adding schools, adding letters of recommendation in there. And you can be working on your writing during that time, but I find that most people really like to just throw themselves into the actual writing, building of the application. So June, by May, June, you're done with your personal statement for sure, because you're going to submit your application. And then we're going to start writing secondaries in June and July, and even maybe a little bit of August. And hopefully you're submitting your secondaries by August, and then August, September, and all the way through the rest of the year, you're waiting for interviews. And it really is a whole year-long process. People sometimes get interviews early, like September, and then sometimes people don't get interviews all the way until February. So it's not cut and dry, same for everybody. There's no way to predict whether you're going to get an early interview or a late interview, or how many interviews. There's just simply zero indication when someone applies. It's kind of, you kind of just have to see how it goes. Any questions about the timeline before we move on? Okay, chat. I don't know where my chat is here.
Nothing so far.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Right. So we've kind of talked every week or every month, we've talked a little bit about what schools are looking for in their applicants. So if you remember, the first couple of weeks, we focused a lot on those attributes and who you are and the competencies. And then last week, we talked about how you take the things that you've done and you show them who you are through your experiences. So what do they really want from a personal statement? Who can remind everybody, how many experience slots do you get in AMCAS? 15. And how many characters per slot? Very good. And for your meaningful, how many for the 3 meaningful? Very good. So there's a lot of characters in the experiences section. So you're going to spend thousands of characters writing your experiences. Do you think that they want to read a list of your experiences in your personal statement? Do you think that professionals like to read the same thing twice? Nope, not at all. Do you think that your story about how you decided to be, well, no, I'm not going to steal my own thunder yet. All right, so we're going to first just establish that your personal statement is not a list of experiences. So what do they want from it? Well, I think we're going to focus on the word personal today. Your personal statement is your story. It's 5,300 characters. Unfortunately, both MCAS and ACOMAS now are the same. And it's less than your experiences section. So you have a very short amount of time to do this. Now, I think I've told most of you that I worked at a medical school for 4 years. I was the director of admissions. I sat through every admissions committee meeting for 4 years and read dozens of personal statements and listened to the doctors who were on the committee talk about the personal statements. And I'll be very honest with you, when I left that job and came here, I had no idea what the prompt was in AMCAS. I don't know if it was just I was a terrible director of admissions or if it was because it just simply didn't matter. We never really discussed what the prompt of AMCAS was. We just read the personal statements and decided if we liked the person or not. However, when I think back to what we were looking for, I do think that there was a common trend in the successful applicants. And so if you look at AMCAS or ACOMAS, there's going to be something written to the effect of why medicine. And I think that that's a really misleading way to ask people what med schools are really looking for. Because when people hear why medicine, I think most people jump to the conclusion that they're asking, how did you decide to be a doctor? Which is really your journey story. So your journey story is how you got to this point. Whether it was you were running down a soccer field and you felt a snap in your knee and you fell to the ground and you rushed to the ER and that doctor was the first doctor who took good care of you and you want to do that for other people. Or if it was, your grandfather who you care so much for and lived with, suffered from Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or dozens of other things. And you were there with him the whole time and they either got really good care and you really admired it, or they got really bad care and you want to make sure no one suffers like that ever again. There's a dozen ways that people could arrive at the decision. Or my other one I hear all the time is, I've just always been a question asker. I love puzzles. I was just the kid who always asked a lot of questions in science class and I just love science, which is cool. No, nothing bad about that. But you're kind of seeing how I'm poking fun at this. If that was any of your reasons, you can see how many times over the last 6 years that I've worked at UC Davis, I have read a personal statement about that topic. So if I'm only one person reading only one university's student population, and I've only been at it for 6 years, and I have read dozens and dozens of stories like that, the same 3 major things. How many do you think someone who reads thousands of apps over the years for decades, how many times have they read those same stories? Can you imagine? It's almost like they almost kind of, I don't want to say poke fun at it, but they kind of like, oh, not another grandpa story. So the problem is, I know that for a lot of people, their elderly grandparents or their elderly relatives, that was a really meaningful experience to you. And, truthfully, a lot of people lose their grandparents in college. It's kind of the natural time that happens. I lost all of my grandparents when I was in college. And so for a lot of people, that's the first time they encountered death. And so that's a really impactful moment. However, I just want to really encourage you. We're going to kind of try today to shift away from describing how you arrived at the decision to pursue medicine. Because let's say Nikita tells me her reason for becoming a doctor, and then Tori tells me her reason, and then Sana tells me her reason. Am I really going to be able to pick which person, Nikita, Tori, or Sana, is going to make a better doctor today based on the random experience that occurred to them that led them to decide to pursue medicine? Is that really indicating whether they're going to be a good doctor one day? No, it's just like what happened to them. And so it doesn't really make sense. It's not really fair to say one person's experience is better than another person's experience. That's not what they're looking for. So that's why I want to kind of pull you away from the why medicine part. And here's a new concept. The real question that they're asking is not, why do you want to be a doctor? They already know you want to be a doctor. You took the MCAT, right? Nobody sits through OChem. Nobody takes a 7.5 hour science test if you don't really want to be a doctor. So they have no doubt that you want this so bad. What they really want to know is, why should we pick you, right? What can you do for us? Why? How do we know you're going to be good at this? When you're applying for a job, you're basically trying to convince them that you can do the job really well, right? You look at the job description, and then you write your cover letter, and you kind of describe past experiences, and you tell them, well, when I did this, it was very much like what you're asking me to do in this position, and I think I could do a good job because blah blah blah. It's really not that different than doing a really good cover letter. We want to try to share as much about our backgrounds as we can. We want to bring in aspects from our childhood if it's relevant. We want to bring in aspects of our perspective and how we see the world, our demographic information if it's relevant. And we want to create a narrative of not only how did you arrive at this, but now that we know you want to do this, what are you going to do with this opportunity? What problems are you going to solve? What are you going to contribute? What perspective do you bring to the table? So another way to think about this is, imagine you're at a med school and there are 8 people sitting around a table. Like, imagine it's a PBL school. So imagine each person at that table. So will all the people at that table be biology majors? Do you think they want a table that's solving medical cases to be all biology majors? No. They're going to want people with sociology majors and philosophy majors and chemistry majors and environmental toxicology majors. They're going to want diversity around that table. Are they going to want all the people at that table to be male or female? Are they going to want some other representation? Maybe some non-binary genders, maybe some, maybe different religions, maybe different, just, let's see, people who've lived in different states. They don't want everybody, to be from Texas sitting around that table. So another thing is, they're going to want to know, how do you see the world? Like, what is your thing, right? So some of you, your thing is really working with research. Some of you want to just dedicate your life to medical research. Some of you, your thing is working with underserved communities. You want to go, and do public health work. Some of you might want to go into academic medicine and teach and do research. But everybody should have something, right? You should have some vision or idea in your head about what it is you want to do. And I know you've probably heard some rumors that you shouldn't put on paper what it is you want to do for the rest of your life at this point. I think that's kind of nonsense. I think if you have a really good idea about what you want to do, there's no harm in saying, I really would love to, do these things. And of course, it'll be much more eloquent than that. But right now, if you have this vision that you're going to work in psychiatry and maybe do research, I think that gives them an idea about who you are today. Now, everybody knows that life isn't linear, and you might change your mind a dozen times. Every adult knows that. Everybody knows you can change your mind. Nobody's saying that if you write in your personal statement you want to go into psychiatry, that you're signing a contract or anything. But it does give us a glimpse into who you are when you have some vision for yourself. And so I've always encouraged applicants to paint a picture, maybe in the conclusion, about where they see themselves going, whether it's working in community clinics because you really want to be able to provide quality care to uninsured patients, or you want to go and do global health and you want to travel the world, or whatever. So especially if you want to go into military medicine, I think letting them know that is really valuable. So here is what a personal statement is not. It is not a list of things that you've done. It's not a story about your background in terms of what happened. So you have an opportunity to write a disadvantage statement. It's 1325 characters, and it appears in the biographic information section. And they read that before they read your personal statement. So a disadvantage statement, there are typically 3 disadvantages. It's not really, there's no real definition in terms of like meeting any requirements or anything, but it's self-identified. But generally there are three. There's academic disadvantage, which means that your K through 12 education was identified as went to a low resource school. You should probably know if you came to college a little less prepared. If you could look at your school if you're not sure if there was a high dropout rate. Environmental disadvantage might look something like you lived in an unsafe neighborhood, or you lived in a home where there was any type of abuse, or heavy drug and alcohol use, or mental health issues. So if your environment didn't kind of held you back or kept you from thriving or didn't give you all the opportunities that others had, that would be an environmental disadvantage. And then the last and most obvious is an economic disadvantage, which typically if you got free or reduced lunch as a child, you would technically be economically disadvantaged. You might not have had any economic issues as a child. Maybe something happened recently. It doesn't matter. It's supposed to be from age 18 below the average number of years. So let's say your family was really poor when you were little, but they got, everything got better and now they're fine. You can still describe your childhood because that's where you developed. If you struggled as a child and didn't get access to enough resources, you could definitely say you came from a disadvantaged background. I've had students who immigrated to America very late in life and talked about just the immigration of having sort of bounced around the world, living in different countries, sleeping on park benches while they were in refugee camps, things like that. And obviously that's a disadvantage. So there's that. So if you write a disadvantage statement, if you decide to do that, then you don't need to go back and tell us all that stuff again in your personal statement because they already have that information. It creates the context. So then when you jump in your personal statement, we can assume they already know that, and you can just get right to it. You talk about the value that you bring because of those things. Now, this is really important. A personal statement is not an explanation.
Before you move on,
yeah.
Could you say, do you know how many characters are in the disadvantage statement? How long?
1325.
1325. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes people feel like they didn't do research long enough. So you might have started it, did it for like 3 or 4 months, and then either realized you hated it or got fired or COVID or something. And so you feel bad. You're like, oh God, they're going to think something's wrong with me because I only did 3 months of research. And no, I don't think anyone on earth cares how long you did research. I think that you don't need to justify why you do and don't do things to anybody. If anyone cares, they'll just ask you. They'll be like, oh, I see, you stopped the research lab after 3 months. What happened? They're not going to like interrogate you and say like, why did you stop after only 3 months? Everybody on earth should be doing research. What's wrong with you? That's not exactly the tone that they take. So if you did stop research, you don't have to say why you stopped. You don't have to say, well, I did research, but I really realized I love working with people. So I quit my research and got a job in the clinic instead. Again, I'm poking fun at something because how many times have I read that over 6 years? Hundreds of times. Enough for me to put it in a PowerPoint. And so I just want to encourage you not to do that. And then this is, you might have heard this in other places that you want to explain your bad grades in your personal statement. And here's why I say you should not do that. So the very first thing they're going to look at, they're going to pull up in your MCAT app. This is the order in which they're going to see things. They're going to pull up your biographic information, which will have everything about your household income, your parents' education level, your disadvantage statement, your just everything about you. Then they're going to go to your grades. They're going to read your grades top, bottom, not across. If they decide at that stage, based on the context from your biographic information, even with that information, if they decide that your grades are so bad that they just can't imagine that you're going to be okay in med school, they're not going to read your personal statement any longer, or your application. They're simply going to be done. They have 6,000 apps. They do not spend 5 to 6 minutes on every single person. They read until they decide they don't want to accept that person and they stop reading. I know that sounds really mean, but that's just truthfully how it works. That's why you want to make sure your grades are okay before you apply, right? So if they get past your grades and they keep reading the words in your app, they're past it. They already decided you're okay. So when you get to your personal statement, here you are, you're trying to sell them the value that you bring to medicine, and then you want to remind them that you have bad grades again? Does that make sense to anybody? If they got past your grades and they're reading all about how great you are, I would not bring up anything bad about myself. I would just keep telling them how great I am. So I personally wouldn't do that. I would just, just pretend like it's not there, because you're going to have chances in your secondaries to talk about things. They're going to ask about struggles. They're going to say, is there anything you want us to know? Is there anything you want to, explain? They ask tons of questions like that in the secondary applications. So you will have a chance to explain your grades in the secondaries because they ask for that. But they didn't ask for that in the personal statement. They're asking you why should we pick you? You don't pick someone because they have bad grades, right? So I would not do that. And again, you'll get contradicting information about that. You're going to have to go with who you trust on that. I probably wouldn't just write one long story in your personal statement. I'd probably include different anecdotes and try to tie them together with some transitions and themes. And your personal statement is not a creative piece of writing. It is a very unique genre. It's not a creative nonfiction. It's not an essay. It's its own genre, but we want to try not to be too creative with it. So this only usually applies to my philosophy people. I find that philosophy people tend to get a little wordy and want to do some creative stuff. And in my experience, it just doesn't work out. It doesn't work out well. So there's a very specific way you want to write it. You want it to be concise, quick, fast-paced. It needs to be anecdotes, but not detailed. So that's why you get help with it, right? You let people who have read a bajillion of them read it and give you feedback. So what we're trying to do, again, is we're trying to reveal the strengths that you bring, your competencies and your attributes. And if you remember from previous weeks, for those who have been coming, those competencies are the AAMC 15 core competencies. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, I really think it'd be a good idea for you to have on hand, printed out, the 15 core competencies. You should print that and post it in front of you on your desk, because those words, those ideas, they should really be directing most of the parts of your application, your experiences. I want you to be looking at those and really thinking about this. Okay, so we know this is what they want. How do I show them that I possess these things as I write my essay? Is there something I could add? Like with any experience you've had, right? There are probably 15 different stories you could tell. So you could tell a story, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a random combo, empathy. You could tell them a story about empathy, which there's nothing wrong with empathy, although if you Google it, there is some controversy around empathy, but there's nothing wrong with empathy. However, if you look at the competency list, is empathy on the competency list? It's not, right? So again, that's a perfectly good thing to have, empathy. But if we are looking at what they're actually measuring in you, it's not what they're measuring right now. They're measuring other things. They're measuring more, I would say, practical skills. So you have to decide, right? Am I going to tell this story about empathy, or am I going to tell this story about, the time I stepped up and had to lead a team and, convince everyone to do something that I needed them to do, or something like that. It's up to you at the end of the day. You get to manage how the world understands you by the stories you tell. Whatever you choose to put in there, they're going to leave that page and a half writing with an impression of you. And, it's scary, it's powerful, it's liberating, because you can define yourself however you want. You don't really like yourself right now, no problem. Just write a personal statement, make it the way you want them to understand you. You're not lying, but you're going to highlight the things you want them to know about you. We are always going to take what we say and we're going to tie it to our future. So that's a little different. People aren't used to talking about themselves as a future doctor or imagining what they would do. And again, you're going to hear some podcasters out there who will disagree with me on this. That's okay. Again, you can go with whoever you trust. This is how I've been helping people for years. Most everybody I help goes to med school, so clearly it's not holding them back. The people I've helped haven't not gotten into med school because they did this. So this is what I say. We want to take what we do. So we would tell a story, we would explicitly state the value that it brings to medicine in your future. And some people say, well, I always heard that you should show, not tell. And I think it's really important that you show and tell. So this sounds really bad. I'm going to say it anyway, though. I think we need to assume that our readers are drunk. And I'm not saying that they are drunk. It's kind of a joke, but, or impaired or so tired. Let's go with tired. That sounds better. So if you are expecting that your reader is going to read your essay slowly and carefully and analyze it, and if maybe they didn't get what you were trying to say the first time, they'll go back and read it again and really like highlight and decipher it, really explicate that text. If you're thinking that's the way these tired, busy doctors are going to read your essay, you are really naive and mistaken. They are not reading your essay like that. They are reading your essay possibly in a really busy, loud setting with beeping in the background, tired, maybe half drunk. I mean, who knows? But they are not analyzing your writing. They are reading it quickly, and they're going to have an impression of you after about a 2-minute skim. And so if you don't tell them exactly what you want them to understand about you, there's a possibility that they're going to miss it. You don't have the luxury of them, hoping that they get your message. So you're going to show them with a story, pull them in, because honestly, people remember narratives. It's human nature. We are tied to stories. So you want to tell stories because people latch onto that. And I can tell you stories from applicants from like 8-10 years ago. So I've been at Davis 6 years and I was at the med school for 4 years. And so I can remember individual people's stories from 10 years ago, which is crazy how the brain works, right? Because I probably heard it one time in an admissions committee meeting and I can still remember it. That's how impactful your personal statement can be if you tell stories. And so you want people to remember your stories, but you also have a mission. You're trying to get into med school. So it's not just a lovely piece of writing. So you need to tell them why what you're telling them is relevant to your future. And that part they might not remember that one line where you're telling them, but that's the part that's going to convince them to click yes on your invite, right? Because it's like, wow, that was a really good story. And she just told me why that's really important for her future and why we should take her and what value she brings to medicine. And that now I don't have to think about it. That's just an easy yes, right? Because she just told me the answer. So that's how we're going to do it. Story and then tie to your future. So if you, I had a question about if your family had problems with COVID, is that a disadvantage? If a disadvantage, I think, it could be. I think it just depends on what the situation is. If you lost a parent, a lot of students have lost parents in college, and I think that definitely talking about that in your disadvantage statement is important. And then if it's financial, like your parents lost their jobs during COVID, I think that is also would count as a financial disadvantage. I'm not sure what else. I suppose all you can do is write it and then you can see it, give it to someone, let someone see what they think. If someone says, I don't really feel like that doesn't strike me as a disadvantage, keep in mind it's self-identified. So it's kind of subjective. You can always save it for a secondary because in secondaries, they're going to ask you things like that. Okay, so let's say you're just getting started. You haven't really written anything yet and you got to get going. What I would do, if you haven't been journaling already, which is a great thing because then hopefully you've written some stories out, but I would start with thinking all the way back to your childhood. So sometimes those moments in our lives that don't really feel that relevant to us are actually really sort of telling or impactful in terms of who you are today. And remind me, I'm going to give you an example of a personal statement that was true for. So things that I can recall from people, I remember someone writing about how their grandmother had Alzheimer's and would, walk up and down the hallway yelling and banging on the walls at night, and it scared her as a child. I guess I'll go ahead and tell you this story. So one time I had a student come in and they had a personal statement and it was kind of like all over the place. They were talking about lots of different things. So one thing in there, they talked about they grew up in a Catholic household. And he remembers sitting in church and he said, I never prayed. I always was looking around at everyone around me, but I never prayed. I was like, okay, it's kind of random. And then he talked about all his friends always got in trouble, but his parents were really strict. And then his cousin, he helped mentor her because she was going to drop out of high school and he got her to stay in college. Then he talked a little bit about his college research. And then he talked about his brother. He had some disease. And he talked about working in a student run clinic. And I was like, okay, there's a lot. You just told me a whole lot of things. I don't understand how any of this stuff makes any sense right now. It's just, you just literally just went from one thing to the next. So I started asking a lot of questions. I was like, okay, so you said you didn't pray in church. So like, what did you do? Like, why are you telling me that? He's like, well, I would watch people. I would look around and after a lot of questions. It turns out what he was doing was he was thinking about why everybody in his church had rotten teeth. He said that all the kids had rotten teeth and a lot of people were really overweight. I said, okay, that's kind of interesting. So as a child, you started to realize that there was a problem in your community, that you didn't have a name for it. You just noticed it as a kid. Fast forward, we were talking about the student-run clinic. Turns out the student-run clinic served the population he came from, or his own population. It served a community very similar to his community that he came from. And I said, well, how did that impact that? How did your childhood impact the work that you did? And he said, well, it impacted a lot because I saw the problems when I was a kid and I saw them again as an adult. In college, I saw the same people have the same problems. But this time I knew things and I could do something about it. As a kid, I couldn't do anything. I just had to watch it. And now I could tell them things. I could tell them how to change their lifestyle, their habits, their eating, and all of that. I said, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder why we don't put those two things together in the same paragraph then. So we did that. We moved those two concepts into the same paragraph. And then we talked some more. I said, oh, what kind of research do you do? Oh, I do some kind of genetic research. Talked about his brother. What's going on with your brother? Turns out his brother had a genetic disease. So he grew up in a household where his brother's genetic disease pretty much dominated most of their life. And then he turns out to do genetic research. I'm like, is that coincidental, you think? Do you think most of the things that we do in life are coincidental? So we put those two things together. And then lastly, we talked about how the kids in his neighborhood often dropped out and were troublemakers. And he ended up mentoring his cousin. And so he talked about just sort of the comparison of going from being at risk of, not getting an education to being the one to be the educator. And I mean, it was just amazing how it transformed from complete randomness to this theme of going from like helplessness to being really helpful and empowered in the position that he was in college. And then he said with the medical education, just imagine what else I could do, how else I can help my community and do things. And so again, this was someone who had no concept that when he was writing out his things from childhood, that they had any relevance, or he didn't understand the power that they had in talking about what he was doing. And it just turned out to be a really great piece of writing at the end. So right now, if you don't know, if you're like hearing this and you're like, I don't have anything like that. My life was really boring. I don't have any stories. Everything was basic. Trust me, it never is. Everybody has something. And so you kind of have to do a lot of digging. You have to think about who you are as a person. So even if, let's say hypothetically, you grew up in a very like middle class or upper class household, and honestly your parents were great. Let's say they loved you, they sent you to all the best camps and you were very well taken care of and you had no issues, and that's like nothing to be ashamed of there, right? That's really great for you, and that's lots of people in that situation get into med school. But you still have to share, something, right? So maybe you have nothing that happened to you in your life, but maybe you know people. Like maybe you grew up with a best friend, or you saw things in your community, or maybe you didn't see anything that was substantial until you came to college. Maybe you had a perfect life, but your sister had an eating disorder, or there was some mental health concerns. Sometimes when we start talking, it comes out that a lot of people's mothers had mental health concerns. I don't know why it's so coincidental, but that's a thing. A lot of people talk about that. If you had an eating disorder or a mental health concern yourself, it's perfectly fine to talk about that. I hear a lot of people tell me they shouldn't talk about that, but I don't know why. The thing about talking about your own mental health or eating disorders is that you want to show them that you are currently in a place where you're thriving. So with like, let's say depression, most people don't ever are ever like fully cured of depression, but you learn how to manage it and you learn how to thrive with it. It's not a good idea to talk about how you currently are struggling with depression while you're simultaneously trying to do an extremely hard thing, because then they're going to worry about you, right? They're going to worry about you're relapsing. And so this only works if you also have a nice grade trend where you've had a nice, chunk of A's at the end where you can demonstrate that you've been thriving. Um, Same thing with eating disorders. If you want to, maybe if you do bring it up and a lot of people talk about it, you might want to talk about how you overcame, and even talk about when your last relapse was and how long ago it was or something like that, so that um, you can show them that you've managed it well for a while. And I mean, there's a lot of different things people can talk about. If you're really not sure if you should talk about it, you can ask, but there's hardly anything you don't, you never have to be afraid to talk about anything. You don't have to worry about talking about religion. Lots of people talk about their religion and get into med school. I would not use your personal statement as a pulpit to preach anything political or anything, but like, let's say you worked for Planned Parenthood and you're worrying because you're thinking, oh, well, they're going to think I'm like pro-abortion and I'm writing that in my personal statement. They don't care. They're doctors. Like they understand what Planned Parenthood is, and they understand people are pro-abortion or pro-life and pro-choice. I mean, they're not here to judge your political beliefs. They're just simply here to decide if you're going to make a good doctor one day. When you become a doctor, you truthfully don't get to decide what kind of medical care you're going to deliver. You deliver whatever the state law says, right? So it doesn't matter what your personal beliefs are. But if it's what you're talking about is relevant to you being a good, and I have no idea why this is dentist, I just saw that. If it's going to explain how it relates to you being a good doctor, then that's all they're trying to do. So I think we did this last time. We talked about how being a good fry cook at McDonald's could relate to being a good doctor. That's exactly what you're going to do in your personal statement. When you tell me a story about something from your life, you're going to think about, why am I telling this story? Like, what does this have to do with my future? And if you can't answer that question, then it doesn't belong in there. And you have to tell us what the answer to that question is at the end of that paragraph. So if I'm reading something and it just like ends mid-story, I'm going to write on your writing, how does this relate to being a doctor? And then your job is to answer that. Does that make sense to everybody?
So there is a question. How would an eating disorder relate to your future as a doctor? Is it more about showing the competency about overcoming challenges?
I think there's a lot of different things people talk about with that. Some people talk about their resiliency. Some people use it as like an opening to talk about how they were inspired. So usually we would just dedicate one paragraph, the intro, to how they decided to become a doctor. And oftentimes it's that doctor that helped them, the eating disorder doctor. I don't know what their technical specialty is called, but it's usually, that's what I've seen the most often, is that it was that doctor that inspired them to want to become a doctor themselves. But truthfully, I mean, I don't know that I have a really, really good example of how they tied it to a competency. If it didn't, if it wasn't relevant to how they're going to be a good doctor, we would have called it out. But almost always, they're in some way, it shares something really meaningful about that person. So the great thing about writing is that it doesn't hurt to try it, right? Like, you can write something, no big deal. If it's terrible, you just cut and paste it out or delete it. It doesn't take that long to write. And I think a lot of people build up the personal statement into this huge thing, but it's a page and a half, and it's your stories. It's just things that happen to you. So you're the only person on earth that knows those stories. you probably could just sit for an hour and tell one story after another, and someone could record you and you'd have your personal statement written. You just got to do the work of tying it back. So I think, try not to build up the process too much of overthinking about what you're doing. If for right now, this is what this slide is about. If you're just really not sure what to do, just sit down and start from childhood and just really think through all of those moments in time where something struck you, something really like impacted you in some way, you realize something. You might not realize right now how it relates or why it was so significant. You don't know why you keep remembering that day when such and such happened, but write it down, because if you keep remembering it and you keep thinking you feel like it's relevant right now for some reason, go ahead and write it out, because we probably will find a parallel with your future or with your present tense. Like I said, so much of our past oftentimes resurfaces and ends up being relevant to what we're doing now. And what I found over the years is that students don't see it. Like, you sometimes can't see how your past is relevant to what you're doing. You're just too close to it. But when someone else points it out to you, then it's like your eyes are open. You're like, oh my God, I just see my whole life in a completely different way right now. So that's kind of a fun experience. I will say that when you're writing your personal statement, when you work with somebody, whether it's me or one of the other advisors, it definitely can be very personal, in the sense that we might ask you really personal questions. And for a lot of people, the personal statement is the first time that they've actually talked about something from their life that they've never shared with people. So for some people, it's like talking about a parent's alcoholism, or talking about some kind of abuse that they experienced, or just anything. Like, sometimes we have these secrets that we really don't want people at college to know about, because we're just trying to be regular old college students and we don't really want to think about it. But for med schools, and it's really debatable whether this is good or not, but med schools do honestly like to know those things, not because they're judging whether you have them or not, or because, um, I don't know how to put it, but they like to know those things because truthfully, those things do shape who you are. We can try to deny that all day long, but the things that have happened to you in your life have formed your personality, have formed your decision making, have made you into the person you are. The good and the bad things have done that. And so sometimes seeing the bad things, it shows your resilience, it shows your perspective. It kind of gives them an idea about what position you might take if you're one of those 8 people at that table. Remember, I talked about being one of those 8 people. If you experience something traumatic, you are definitely going to approach things differently than the other people who haven't experienced that. And so it's sort of like when you write your stories, you want to think about, how am I going to get to that table? How am I going to be one of those 8 people? And you don't have to be, I've read things or saw things like how to be a purple cow or something at the conference. It's like people tell you have to be truly unique. I hate that. It's so much pressure to be truly unique. And it's really almost impossible to be unique, because they've had 10,000 applicants for 10 years. And honestly, like, everyone's kind of done similar things. But what you don't need to worry about is like being 100% unique. You need to worry about being valuable. So lots of people who are similar get into med school, but they all bring something. And so you got to know what that something is. And you can have 10 people in the same class that bring the same something. They take 100 people, but you got to bring something. And that's the most important part. So once you have all your stories, we're going to synthesize them. We're going to look for themes, and themes emerge naturally. A lot of people come to me really, really stressed because they'll say, well, I don't have a theme in my writing. That's okay. Not all writing has themes, and you can't force a theme on a piece of writing. And you can't, I wouldn't start with a theme and try to pull stories to kind of force that to happen. Like, themes kind of just emerge naturally based on certain people's stories. And so I just want to be clear about that, because I think that causes some people some stress about whether they have one or not. Most people don't know their theme until there's several drafts in. And once you start to move things around and really think and ask, the advisors are asking you tough questions, and you start unpacking some of the things you say, a lot of times people will start their personal statement on a really surface level, and we're going to hear us say, you got to go deeper. You really have to unpack what you mean by that. You can't say generic things. If you want to get into med school, you're going to have to unpack. You're going to have to keep drilling, deeper, saying more reflective things, more honest things. The more honest and reflective you are, the more you're going to catch people's attention. Okay. Any questions about that? So I guess my advice would be gear up for a lot of talking and a lot of thinking about yourself as a person. For some people, this is a really good time to see a therapist. If you have never talked about anything and you know that you're going to end up talking about some of those things in a personal statement, and you know it might trigger you and you're going to feel bad about it, then going ahead and working on getting a therapist and talking through that with somebody. That way, it doesn't trigger you if you do get triggered by talking about certain things. If you realize that you do not want to talk about something and it comes up, then you need to be clear about that. You need to say to the advisor, I do not want to talk about that, and then they won't push it. So if you can't like reference something in your personal statement and then expect no one to ask any questions or not, ask about it in an interview. So if you bring it up, it's like fair game, right? Anyone can ask you what you mean by that. Yeah, definitely. If you see a therapist and you overcame your challenge through therapy, that'd be a great thing to say. 100%. All right. So as you get going, there are lots and lots of structures you can use to write your personal statement. Some people do really short, like choppy blocks of writing, like short paragraphs. Some people do pairing of concepts, like they'll do something from your past to something from your present, like I described. If you really are not sure how to go about it, you could start with a really basic 5-paragraph essay. There's nothing wrong with this structure. Lots of people do it. And that would start with an opening story where you put us in a moment. So you literally start in the middle of a story, you're in the middle of doing something, and I want to see you in action. So I don't need to know all about your grandpa or all about your whatever. I need to see you doing something. So try to always keep it in your perspective. And then you're going to lead me by the end of that first paragraph to some concept, to some thesis statement. Essentially, it's, I want to be a good doctor one day. But if you could drill that down a little bit more, like, I want to be a doctor who provides culturally and linguistically appropriate care to underserved communities. Okay, that's a little bit more specific than just, I want to be a doctor. If I want to contribute to finding a cure for Alzheimer's through academic medicine, that's great. Like, it's okay to say again what you want to do. So as specific as you can, or if you don't really know what you want to do, then just talk about like what kind of doctor you want to be. I want to be the kind of doctor that does whatever. Then you're going to have 3 supporting paragraphs. So how do you become a doctor who provides linguistically and culturally appropriate care? Well, I did that by growing up in a community where I saw this, and then I did this in college also. So you maybe do something about linguistics, you do something about culturally appropriate care, and maybe you do something about building trust. It's a really common theme. And then you would start your conclusion with something like, these are all the things I just said. So doing this, this, and this. And then you end it with, so this is who I am. I mean, you're not in these words, but like basically, so this is what I've done. Now med school, all I need from you is the training and the education so I can go out into the world and do these great things. So you summarize at the beginning, and then you just kind of wrap it up with like your last appeal to say, I really like the opportunity to be able to use all these things I have or all this insight that I bring and go to your med school. Any questions? Okay. So some basic do's and don'ts. Writing honestly, but more importantly, writing with your own voice is so important. There's a person who used to help a lot of undergrads, and he was probably like a 60-year-old, he's probably 60, I'm sure, white male, very, very talented. He is a very good writer, spent his whole life as a writer. He would help people's writing. And when they came back and showed me their piece of writing after working with this person, I literally could hear this person talking in their writing. And it's because he helped them so much that their voice disappeared and was replaced with his voice, meaning they used the words that he would use and they used the phrasing that he would use. And while it was a really eloquent piece of writing, it was not their writing. It didn't sound like them. And so you don't need to use a thesaurus. You don't need to try to sound suddenly like a different person. Like, write the way you normally talk. And your voice is important. So really don't try to like camouflage it with big fancy words that you would never say normally. Okay. Sometimes I read things in personal statements and I literally don't even know what the word means. It's because they were trying to sound really smart. So I'm like, I don't know what this means. You're gonna have to tell me. That's not very effective, is it? Always try to reveal as much as you can about yourself, as much as you're comfortable doing. Like, this does say show instead of tell, but I need to change this. This is old. It should say show and tell, not show instead of tell. And then tie to the field. Okay, this is a big one. Some people like to have as many people as possible read their personal statement. And I think that it could be problematic because if you ask everybody under the sun to read your essay, people like to help people. So let's say your essay is actually really good and you say, hey, tell me what you think about this. Some people will come up with something just because they want to help you, right? They'll just come up with something to tell you to change. And you're going to think like, you thought it was pretty good and we've been working on it. And you're like on draft 25 and you're like, and then this person's like, well, maybe you should consider talking about this instead. And you take that advice literally. And then you come back to whoever and you're like all upset because this person told you now you're confused and should you be including this instead? And like, oh, geez, just stop, please. Like, no, it's perfectly fine. You only have a page and a half. Of course, you could talk about 50 different things. You have to pick and choose which 3 or 4 things you're going to talk about, which is hard. So when you ask a lot of people to read it, you have to be prepared to get a lot of different perspectives. Do you really need that many perspectives? Maybe you need a few, but you don't need it to the point where everyone's giving you contradicting advice. I would pick and choose people you trust. So I honestly would just pick someone from HPA, and you want to start with one person and then you want to start letting some other people at HPA read it. We actually really think it's a good idea to bounce around as you go further along. So as you get started, maybe do 2 or 3 drafts with the same person. And then once you kind of have a flow going, that person might even say, like I do this sometimes, I'm like, okay, I've hit a wall. I need you to go let Elizabeth look at it because she's going to say something else. Sometimes even the person helping you with their writing, if they're too invested in you, they also become blinded and biased and they think your writing is great. So giving it to a different person who has read a lot of statements and can compare. And that's a great thing about using a professional is that we've seen the people who get into med school, right? Like we know who they are, we know which essays have gotten in and which ones haven't. And so we have an idea, but like if you give it to your mom or your mom and your dad think you're pretty great, right? They think you should get into med school. Like, well, what's wrong with this? The other problem with giving it to your mom and dad is sometimes you can't be really honest about what happened in your household. If you're talking about your mom and dad, if you give it to your mom and dad, they're not going to like that very much. So I probably would try to resist it unless you have a really good relationship with your parents. But I've had people who get really, really upset after giving it to their parents because the feedback was not so positive. But it's up to you, you can decide. Another problem is giving it to people who are doctors like from the 70s when they started med school, because it's very different now than it was back then. And so they may tell you things that don't make a lot of sense. I've had that happen a few times. And then generally, I've had really bad experience with people giving their personal statements to PIs. So if you have a PI or like a postdoc or somebody in your research lab who wants to help you get into med school, I just would really encourage you to not take everything they say and do everything. Sometimes I've just had over the years enough people say things to me that just makes me cringe about some of the things that they're being told in their research labs. Not all researchers are bad, I'm not saying that, but just some of them don't have the right information about how you should be approaching this. And I've had people be moving really well in their drafts and we're really, everything's really driving and it's going well. And then they let their PI read it and they trash it and they come back to me upset and they're like, I'm going to rewrite the whole thing. I'm like, why? We have been doing so well. Everything is great. It looks amazing. It's up to you, Diana. You have to decide who you trust. I'm just telling you what I have experienced. If your PI, if you have your PI, if you start with your PI and then you're writing it and then you bring it to HPA and like, I'm like, I don't like this at all, then you're going to have to decide who you want to go with, because you can't make everybody happy, obviously.
Can I give a sort of a PhD perspective on that? That your PI, a lot of times, if they're a hardcore researcher and they're thinking about what they would want to see as a personal statement from somebody coming into graduate school, which is different than medical school. So they might actually be looking for something different in that letter than what a med school admissions officer is going to be looking for. So that's why I think it's not that necessarily PIs are doing it, they're bad people or anything like that. It's just that they don't know what a med school person is looking for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think sometimes, not obviously the MD PhD person, but sometimes I think some researchers, this is just, again, me, years of experience, hearing things, sometimes I think they might be a little bitter about people who don't want to do research and who would rather go to med school. And I don't know if there's any truth to that, but sometimes I just think there might be a little attitude about that. Do you think there are issues with having a current med student read it? Yeah, well, it could be. Okay, so here's the thing. I love med students, right? Because they're only 1 year away from being my students. But sometimes people who become med students think that they are also experts now on admissions. And truthfully, unless you have studied data and you have like talked to admissions and worked for admissions, you really don't understand holistically how the whole process works. You only know that you got in. So you could say, I got into med school and I did X, Y, and Z. I promise you that if 10 of you come in my office and we're talking about getting you into med school, I am not telling all 10 of you the same thing. So if I tell you, like, let's say you come to an advising appointment with me and I tell you something, don't go tell your friends they should do that, because that was appropriate for you. Every person gets into med school in their own way. Every person is different. Every person brings their own background and their own stories and everything. So that person knows how they got into med school, but they don't know if that strategy is the best thing for their person they're helping. So it's not that they can harm you. It's just that I would always get a second opinion, right? Like I would always have someone else who's looked. And then the other thing is, like, has that person read a ton of personal statements, or again, have they only looked at their own? Like we have a medical student on our staff right now, Noreen. And the reason why I don't have a problem with her helping people is because I helped her. And I know that everything in her mind is what I have, I've trained her. We had Mary before, who same thing. Like I helped Mary. I spent hours and hours with Mary on her personal statement and so I don't mind her helping you because I know she's going to say the things that I said. So I've trained her. But if you just have a random medical student helping you, I don't know where they're getting their information, and that makes me nervous for you. Does that make sense?
There's a question. Should we only stick to 2 to 5 people throughout the whole personal statement process?
Yeah. So as you get further along, like let's say you have your paragraph structured, you decided on the content, you decide, I'm not going to change this, I'm going to go with this. So now you're going to pick different people to do a test, but you're not going to give your personal statement and say, what do you think? You don't care what people think. Like, that's not what you're asking. You're going to give them the personal statement. You're going to say, tell me what this paragraph makes you understand about me, or what do you understand about me from this paragraph? So you need to ask targeted questions of them. So if, let's say, you're trying to get the reader to understand that by through your experience, you will be able to connect with people quickly and provide culturally appropriate care. That's the message you really want the reader to understand. So you give them that paragraph and they read it. If they don't come up with that conclusion, then you know that you need to go back to your writing and make your writing more clear. So if they're like, oh, I think this is like talking about teamwork and you're a good leader from this paragraph, and you're like, what? no, like that's not at all what I was trying to say. I was trying to, so you want to manage your readers. And the only way to know if that's working is to give, specific, you can give the whole thing or you can give specific paragraphs and say like, what does this make you think of when you read this? Rather than, do you like it? So if you manage how people understand you, truthfully, when you apply, you're going to apply to 30 schools, more than likely, many of you. How many interviews do you hope to get out of 30? Don't say 30. What would make you happy? How many interviews? No one has a number on their head? 5. I think 5 is a really good number. Yeah, I think if you get 5 med school interviews, you are pretty solid. So you got 5 med school interviews. 25 people didn't like you. That's not true. They probably liked you. They just didn't have enough spots in their school for everybody. But truthfully, like 25 people didn't decide that they wanted to invite you. Or decide they didn't want to invite you. That's why you apply to 30 schools. I mean, there are going to be people who don't like what you have to say, but that doesn't mean that you are a failure. That's why you apply to so many. I mean, the thing that's going to increase your odds of getting more interviews is by picking schools. Oh, we're going to talk all about this when I do or choosing your med school list. I'm going to talk about how you can increase the odds of getting more interviews. But that's something you can control by letting people know, first knowing what you want to say, saying it clearly, asking people if they're getting what you're trying to say. Because if you don't test it and you're just kind of like hoping people get what you're trying to say, that's kind of random. I wouldn't really apply to med school in a random way like that. I think I'd want to have it a little bit more under control. So you would write it, ask people, what does this make you think of? They say, oh, it makes me think this, this, and this. And then when you hear their reactions, then you decide, am I okay with that they thought that or they didn't think that? But you're not asking them to edit it and like change it and suggest and all of that, because that's going to throw you for a loop and it's going to cause you a lot of stress. I mean, it's kind of, I don't know if there's like a timeline like that. I don't know if I can say, at week 14 or something. I think it depends on your writing. And I would just, when you're kind of hitting a dead end with your, whoever you're working with, then you can start to venture out and get some different opinions. Usually the people you're working with will say like, oh, maybe you should get a different opinion and see what someone else thinks about that.
There was another question a little earlier too, is if we tell multiple stories in our personal statement, how important is it to keep it in chronological order?
It's not. You don't have to keep it in chronological order. It can be, that's what a thematic essay is. It's more based on concepts than story, the journey of your life. When you find yourself kind of doing first I did this, then I did this, then I did this, then it just, that's when it starts to feel like you're just listing things. And the other thing is, please don't start your essays with, I knew I needed to get volunteer experience, so I decided to volunteer at the blah, blah, blah. Like, no, don't tell me why you did an experience. Just jump into the experience. While I was volunteering at Imani Clinic, I saw every Saturday, blah, 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 right? Don't justify why you did things. Nobody cares. Nobody cares why you did anything. They're just here trying to figure out who you are. You don't have to explain yourself. Does that make sense? And you're wasting characters doing that. You only have so many characters. So you want to just like get in and out, like get into your stories as fast as possible so you can say more things about you. All right. Okay, here are some don'ts. Don't just tell me. Oh, I must have used this one for dentistry. Sorry about that. So don't just tell me how you arrived at the decision to pursue medicine and then just keep drilling me over and over about how bad you want to be a doctor. After I read you want to be a doctor the first time, I get it. You don't have to say it 5 more times that you want to be a doctor. And that's something people do, is I think they just like keep justifying. They use each story to justify why they want to be a doctor. And I'm like, by the 3rd time, I'm like, I get it, but why should I pick you? It's not the Hunger Games. You don't get to like rush the door and survival of the fish. You got to like, use some rational thought and actually share how you're going to do well in this job. Don't tell me why you didn't choose something else. Again, don't criticize the field. Okay, so let's talk about that because that's also a big thing. People know now mostly not to do this, but there's a difference between directly criticizing medicine and talking about a bad situation. So if something bad happened to you as a result of your care, it's okay to talk about that. You don't have to say, my doctor was terrible and I want to make sure that no one else suffers the way I suffered ever again. That's why I want to be a doctor. That's not, you don't need to say that, because first of all, you're not going to prevent other people from suffering, because you can't stop every doctor in the universe from being a bad doctor. You're only going to be able to do what you can do with your patients. So keep it focused on you and keep it focused on what you would do in that situation, rather than saying, doctors should really listen to their patients. Say, I will listen to my patients. Does that make sense? Then you're not criticizing anybody. You're just saying what you'd like to do, which makes sense. Yeah, good. Listen to your patients. We like that. Don't use hyperbolic language. You can't assume to know what people are feeling. So you can't say things like, Miss Green, after seeing me, felt so relieved. You don't know what Miss Green felt. You know what Miss Green looked like. You know what her facial expression looked like, and you know how she behaved, but you have no idea how she felt. So try not to say things like that's not exactly hyperbolic, that's a different issue, but try not to say how people feel, and then try not to just make broad sweeping generalizations about people, groups of people, because again, truthfully, it's never true, right? Like there's never all patients or all doctors. Try not to use second person. Oh, don't say you're going to solve huge world problems that no one else on earth has been able to solve before. If you're going into medicine, you probably are not going to change laws. If you want to change, like if you want to contribute to universal health care, you're going to have to go into politics. There are certain things you're just not going to do as a doctor. So the more, so the patient looked relieved. That'd be great, rather than saying, she was so happy after talking to me. So knowing the scope of your work as a physician, I think, is part of understanding what you're getting yourself into. And that's kind of what they're looking for too. They want to know that you know what you're doing in terms of the career you're entering. So when you say things like, it really upsets me that people who don't have insurance can't get access to quality care. So I want to go into medicine so I can provide quality care to people who don't have insurance. Awesome. So what does that look like? Are you going to work full-time giving away your services for free? That's not what you mean, surely. So you're going to volunteer on Saturdays at a free clinic when you're, not working full-time at the hospital. If you're going to make a claim like that, actually describe what you're going to do, because otherwise it sounds like you don't understand that you're going to work 50 to 60 hours a week in a hospital, and for at least the first decade of your career. It sounds like you think you can just go volunteer all the time in free clinics, which you can't, because you're going to be working all the time. And then some of you will get married and some of you will have children. And sometimes we just don't have time in life to go volunteer all the time. But you can definitely do it, on some Saturdays. Like, that's realistic, but you can't just give away you can't give away your profession for free, because you also have to pay your student loan bills. So, they know that. They're going to be a little critical of you if you say things like that. And if you think you can, then say it. Tell us how, right? Like if you're going to go into military medicine, you're going to walk out of med school debt-free and serve for 7 years and then be debt-free, and you can do whatever the heck you want with your life, then tell us that. Be clear about that. And then they'll be like, oh, that sounds cool. That's a good plan. All right. Let's see. So we talked about this a little bit. Every person is different. You are not going to make everyone happy, and you need to really understand and accept that right now. But by managing what you say and making sure that you try to standardize people's understanding about your message, you are at least having some control over how people understand you. We understand that not everyone will like you, but you still want to manage what you're saying about yourself. We don't want it to be like just random have everybody read it and get a different message from it. It's important when we think about this process that we don't say things like, what do med schools want? Okay, we all need to really understand we're not talking about med schools. We're talking about human beings reading your essay and making a decision about you in about 5 minutes. And there's going to be lots and lots of different kinds of human beings. And what do we know about human beings? We know human beings come with implicit bias. We know human beings, I'm going to answer your question just a sec, Diana. Human beings have preferences and they have their own background and they have their own baggage, and they have different likes and dislikes. Most schools, no. So most schools, you're going to get screened once. And if you get an interview, they'll put you on a list, and then the dean will screen the interview list again. And then that person will select people from the interview. So most interview invites get 2 screens, but most screens that make it either to like a wait list for an interview or rejection usually get screened by one person. They have 6,000, most schools have 6,000 applications, and there's just virtually no way that they could read every application twice. Now, I'm not saying there is no school out there that does that. There could be schools that read applications twice. I'm talking generally, the majority of them are going to give you one read, one time, which is why we're going to start your personal statement in January, right? Because we want it to be really good. And again, this is 100% anecdotal. I don't have a spreadsheet or anything to share with you, but I will say to you, the people that I have worked with the most and the longest have gotten into med school. There are very few people that I've worked with, and people, and not just me, all the HPA advisors that come to the office on a regular basis or make appointments on a regular basis and show up and really commit to this and do the work. Those people get into med school. Okay. It does take time. It takes a lot of energy. You're going to have to do work with us. You're going to have to do work on your own. We're going to tell you a lot of things. Sometimes it's going to suck. You're going to be mad at us. You're going to feel uncomfortable. But that's okay, because when we're uncomfortable, we usually grow, right? So it's a process. It takes a long time, but it'll be worth it when you get accepted. I always joke. I tell people, I don't really care at all if you hate me, as long as you get into med school, right? You can hate me the whole time. Won't affect me at all. I'm still going to tell you what you need to do. And once you get into med school, you'll probably forgive me. People who were really hateful to me while they were students, now they're med students, they're super friendly to me. Somehow, some way they forgave me. I'm sure they're happy now. Not that I'm going to be mean to you or anything, but sometimes, yeah, it's a painful process and it's uncomfortable to apply. It's very stressful. But we'll get through it. Everybody does. So, any questions, thoughts, concerns, problems, reactions? Do you have an idea about what to do now? Like how to start, brainstorm, anything like that? Or did I confuse you more? Yeah, please ask whatever you'd like. You can ask me anything. You can ask me about prereqs, or you can ask me anything but about the MCAT. You have to ask Doug about that. Go ahead, Diana. Do you want to unmute Diana? Yeah, Madeline, that's a great question. Please come to drop-ins on Tuesdays. We can definitely do personal statements. 15 minutes is absolutely long enough to do personal statements. It only takes about 5 minutes to read it. Are you there, Diana? Okay, let's see. Maybe Doug stepped away.
I was just seeing if Diana actually wanted to unmute or
Oh,
not.
yeah. Did you want to unmute Diana? Oh,
she has to come from there.
Gotcha. Is it okay to shadow a doc that is out of the country? Yeah, it's okay to do any type of experience internationally. A lot of people A lot of people do Peace Corps, a lot of people do global trips, some people do research internationally. It's not a problem. You probably, the only issue that's ever come up with international work is like letters of recommendation. If English isn't their first language, that can be a challenge sometimes. Right now, those are our only drop-ins. We might add drop-ins. I mean, we typically stay past 3 o'clock. So if you're in the room before 3, we'll typically stay. So if you can't get in, like if you can get in by like 2:45, we'll stay as long as we can. But we might add drop-in hours. It's just been, yeah, we haven't been extremely busy for drop-ins, so I don't know if we will, but we'll see if as we gear up, we probably will. We'll post them when we do. Can I, yeah, ask anything you want. Yeah, it's Diane, it's fine. You can get a letter of rec about from anybody. It's totally fine. The only, about letters of rec, I think we had that session. It was about making sure they're on letterhead and making sure it's signed. You just want to make sure that they're using their organization's letterhead. Are the people at Davis who apply internationally that a valid option if we want to practice? I think that's saying add a disadvantage. Are you talking, I think the question is it okay to go to an international med school if you want to practice in the US? And there are definitely, I mean, a lot of people in the United States who did their medical school education at either a Caribbean med school or the Australian med school, and there's a couple others around the world. The most important thing is if you're going to choose to do that, you need to make sure that there are some really legit schools. Like, for example, AUC and Ross are owned by an American corporation. So those are legit schools, right? Like you're not going to go there and it's not like a sham or anything like that. There are actually 50 medical schools in the Caribbean. Many of those I would be horrified if you step foot in. But there are like 3 big ones: St. George's, AUC, and Ross. St. George's is a true international med school. It's owned by Grenada, but AUC and Ross are American corporations. So, the issue is not whether you can become a physician if you go there. It's about you kind of like surviving that experience, not literally surviving, but surviving med school in that experience. And you kind of have to know what you're getting yourself into when you do that. But if you can make it through the medical education there and do well, which most people do because people who go to Caribbean med schools don't choose that. It's usually their last resort. And they've been told probably many times before that they can't do it by people, which is unfortunate. And so they have a little bit of like a attitude about it. So they're going to prove to the world that they can be a doctor. So they fight for it. Usually Caribbean students fight really hard. They work really hard. It's very competitive. They're usually huge classes. You're in a large group of very competitive people. And then when you come back, you're outworking everybody because you're trying to prove again that you're good enough. So it's kind of like an inferiority complex is what we found. And so when you outwork people and you outstudy people, you typically do better in life. I mean, that's generally what happens when you outwork people. So generally, like I said, I've met so many alum from the Caribbean med schools who are very, very successful. Let's see, did I miss anything?
So I didn't attend the letter of rec workshop. You might have talked about this. Do you recommend asking now, or is it still too early? Is March a better time?
You can ask whenever you want. If you're using an Interfolio, then there's no harm in asking. You can go ahead and upload them if they say yes right now. If you're not going to use an Interfolio, if you're just applying to AMCAS or ACOMAS, then just let them know the timeline that you're going to be adding them in May, and they'll get the email in May to upload their letter.
And I think that has answered the second question. So the next one is, so I want to apply to medical schools end of senior year. How do I make sure I'm staying in touch with professors along the way, maintaining good relationships without telling them I eventually want a letter of rec?
How do I make sure without telling them? I think you definitely want to tell them that you're going to be applying to medical school and that you would like a letter of rec. And they will not write your letter of rec probably until you're ready to apply. But if they say, yeah, sure, I'll write you a letter of rec, then I would say every 6 months or so, just send them an email and update them on your life, let them know what you've been up to, and thank them again for offering to write you a letter. They'll probably write some notes about you. Um, so they have that, but it's your job to follow up with them. If you ask them and then you don't talk to them for like 2 more years, that's, they don't respond to you. I mean, that's kind of on you. You kind of have to do that. You have to stay in touch with them.
Yeah, I think I see this a lot where people are afraid to tell professors before they need the letter that they want the letter. And I think that's a bit of a fear of like how the professor's going to react. Like, oh God, you're one of those. And they don't do that. They professors are expecting that students are going to ask them for letters of rec. And
Yeah.
it's better just to prompt it and say that person will probably respect you for saying that, to be honest. You're giving them warning, giving them time to collect their thoughts and get that thing done. So don't be afraid of telling them.
Someone asked a question in a private chat. I'll just ask it generally, about if you get a degree in one country, can you practice medicine in a different country? And every country has their own policies on that. They have accrediting bodies. So, for example, if you went to a particular med school, let's say you found a med school in Spain, and you can't just go to that med school and think that you can just come back to the United States and work. Whatever state you're going to work in and take your licensing exam in the US has to credit that school. Same thing, like if you get a medical degree in the US, most countries are probably going to honor a US medical degree, but I don't know 100% if every country in the whole world does. You have to check with the country you want to go to. So yeah, every country is going to have policies on different, not policies, but going to have accreditations for different schools, and you just have to make sure if you're going to do international work that you are checking into
that. Two more questions I think is about all we'll have time for. So number one question is, what is interfolio? Heard it multiple times. Don't really understand what it is. Mm-hmm. And the other one, is it allowed a good idea to ask TAs for letters of rec?
Yeah. Interfolio is it's like think about it like a storage unit for letters. So you pay a company a service fee to store letters until you need them. So let's say you're 2 years out from applying, but you have someone who says they'll write you a letter right now. You can add their information in, they'll get the email from Interfolio, they upload the letter, and it just stays there until you're ready to apply. And then you connect Interfolio to the application system. You still have to waive your rights to the letter. So you're always going to waive your rights to the letter, even if you use the application system. And that means that you're not going to see the letter. And then the second question, it's perfectly fine to ask for a TA to write a letter. The only challenge is that a lot of TAs just don't have any experience writing letters. And so they might not know how to write a letter. They might not know like the nuance of the whole process. And so what some people do is they'll talk to their TA and ask the TA if they think the faculty member will co-sign a letter with them, because the faculty member then might take a look at the letter or contribute to the letter. Worst case, the letter is fine and the faculty and the TA, they don't collaborate, but the faculty just signs the letter at the bottom. It's not that it's 100% necessary to do that. I really haven't heard anything from my medical school colleagues about preferences in that way, but I think that generally, like, there are good letters and not great letters. And I don't mean in terms of what they say about you. I mean in terms of like saying you're amazing or you're only mediocre. I mean, they're just the way the letters are written. So if a faculty member says, Megan got a B+ in my class and she ranked 80th out of 100. And in this class, I teach this, this, and this. That's a terrible letter. Like, that says nothing about Megan. That's just information like we already knew her grade, right, from her transcript. And I mean, it's kind of creating context. 80 out of 100, that's not bad, but it doesn't really say anything about Megan. And so if you had a TA write it and the TA said, Megan showed up early to all of my labs. She always asked questions. She stayed after. I watched her work in groups. She was very collaborative and she had great communication skills. Great student to have in class. Worked really hard, got a B+. Clearly that's a good letter. So the schools would always rather read something like that than read, some nonsense template from a professor. When you ask for letters of rec from a professor and you know that they don't know you at all, it is your job to tell the professor your narrative from their class. You need to tell them how you experienced their class so that maybe they might pull something from what you tell them to include in your letter. So you might say, I really grew in this way from your class. I really, as anything, like I struggled in your class, but then I took your feedback and I changed. Like, be as specific as you can and tell them something. No, yeah, thanks, Doug. You should always waive your rights to your letters, and you cannot upload letters yourself. Med schools expect that you have not seen your letters. If you have seen your letters, you do not want to in any way suggest that you have, because that would be very problematic for you. I mean, you technically can say you did not waive your rights, but I just don't think that's a great idea.
Yeah, agreed.
You should aim for, well, first you have to know what schools require, and every school requires something different, but based on in the past, most people have between 4 and 5 depending on the school requirements. So it generally would be something like 2 science letters, a non-science letter, and a non-academic person.
All righty, so I think that's about time. We need to take a break and get ready for our second half. So thank you, Joanne, for all the information about personal statements and about letters of rec, since we recycled that topic a little bit. So that's awesome. Make sure we get all these questions answered. So
Yep.
we are going to take about 10 minutes. We'll come back. Let's say we'll be back at 11, or sorry, not 11, at 10:43, and we'll be ready to get back and started with some OChem. So thanks again, Joanne.
Yeah, no problem. Have a great weekend, everybody. See you later.
And then if you're sticking around for the Princeton Review Organic Chemistry mini lesson, we're going to get set up for that right about now. And all righty, welcome back from the break. I want to introduce Dr. Candace Ulmer. She is a organic chemistry instructor with the Princeton Review, and she's going to walk us through a mini lesson with organic chemistry today. So thank you for popping in today, Candace.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And can you still see my slides?
Yes, we can. So
all right, great.
Take it away.
All right, thank you. So as was mentioned, my name is Dr. Ulmer. Feel free to refer to me as Candace. And I am a Princeton Review Organic Chemistry and General Chemistry instructor, and also serve as a tutor. So before we get started, I do just want to give you a brief intro to who I am and how I got started working with the Princeton Review. So I am actually a native of South Carolina, and I attended the College of Charleston for undergrad, where I got my bachelor's degree in both chemistry and biochemistry. At the time I was pre-med, but I started doing research in a laboratory setting and realized that that was where my passion was. So I switched gears and applied to graduate school at the University of Florida, where I then obtained a PhD in chemistry with a focus in analytical chemistry. So there I was kind of working on looking at biomarker discovery, kind of bridging the tie between medicine and chemistry, and the translation of laboratory medicine. And so afterwards, I continued with that research, did a postdoc in a government laboratory because I was pretty sure I wanted to obtain a career in government. And so I did a postdoc in a government lab in South Carolina at the National Institute for Standards and Technology. And so while working there, I just randomly received a phone call from who my current boss is at the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia, saying that they needed a clinical chemist and was I available. So I literally dropped everything and moved here to Atlanta, Georgia to start working for the CDC. And I've been working at the CDC since 2017. And so some of you may be wondering if I'm working on anything dealing with COVID-19, and my research does not involve anything dealing with COVID. Where I work at the CDC, my research is involved with standardizing protein hormone measurements and just making sure that no matter where you go and kind of get a blood draw, both here domestically and internationally, we're always going to get the same number. So just ensuring that our biomarker measurements are always going to be accurate to ensure that the diagnosis and treatment of diseases is going to be consistent. So I started working with the Princeton Review back in 2014 as a graduate student, and just basically kind of continued doing that. So I have over 15 years of experience kind of working as a tutor and as an instructor. And what we're going to go over today is just a mock lecture for what it's like if you were to enroll in a Princeton Review course in organic chemistry. And so what I'm going to cover today is lecture 1 of that material, as if you were going to see it in one of our classes. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'm going to be looking at it consistently. And if you want to, feel free to use any of the Zoom features like yes, no, to participate, thumbs up, thumbs down, because I do want this to be a very interactive lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to cover today is dealing with some fundamental structure and stability for organic compounds. And so specifically for the organic chemistry section of the MCAT, it's going to focus heavily on understanding. So if you've taken any OChem classes yet, you know that there are a lot of different mechanisms, a lot of different reagents, etc. Luckily for the OChem section of the MCAT, you are not required to memorize specific reagents or any of that, but you do need to understand the fundamentals. So what I'm going to cover today are some of those fundamentals and essentially how you would apply them to different situations and different scenarios that you may see in a passage on the MCAT. All right. So if this was a normal class, essentially what we would ask students to do is to participate, to bring in any of the materials that are required for our lectures, and to participate in pre-reading, as well as to participate in any homework that we assign. So let's talk about where organic chemistry kind of shows up on the MCAT. So there, within these science sections, are 59 questions and approximately 95 minutes to answer them. So that equates to about 1 minute and 36 seconds per question. And so we see for the science sections, there are about 10 passages and 4 to 6 questions per passage. And so specifically for organic chemistry, what we see is that it falls under 2 main sections that represents the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, and then the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems. So in actuality, what that means is that approximately 15% falls with this chem and phys foundation section, so about 9 questions, and 5% of the biological and biochemical foundation section is actually OChem. So that's about 2 to 3 questions. So you know that with your actual classes, you have 2 semesters worth of organic chemistry, but on the MCAT, what we tend to see is only about, 12 to 15 questions be OChem related. So there's a lot of content to have to go through and to prepare for to only see 15 questions. So hopefully what I'll show you today is what you need to focus your efforts towards so that you aren't very overwhelmed in studying. Okay, so fundamentals for organic chemistry, essentially what you want to remind yourself and refresh your memory on are the IUPAC system for naming, specifically for alkanes, for alkyl halides, as well as for alcohols. You want to be able to recognize any of the functional groups, such as the ones that I've listed above, as well as how to name them. And we'll cover a little bit today about how to draw some of these structures, but you definitely want to refresh your memory on how to draw Lewis dot structures. And so what you'll see sometimes on the MCAT is that they alternate whether or not they include electron pairs on Lewis dot structures, whether or not they include positive and negative charges, but all of that information is supposed to be understood. So you definitely need to have a pretty thorough understanding of how to draw Lewis dot structures. Okay. So are there any questions for me before we get started? And I see that you guys actually have 3/4 of OChem. So that's quite a bit of OChem for only, 12 to 15 questions worth of material in the MCAT. All right, so seeing none, let's go ahead and start jumping into the material. So because I only have about an hour and a half, I'm probably only be able to cover Roman numerals 1 through 4 before having to kind of break. But this is still a good bit of information and hopefully very useful for you in kind of seeing how to study and how to pull information that's going to be relevant to what you'll see on the MCAT for organic chemistry. So normally our OChem sections for the Princeton Review, whenever I lecture, tend to be about 3 hours long. So that's why we're only going to be able to cover about half of this today. All right, so let's get started first with this idea of saturation and unsaturation. So normally whenever we see a compound and it doesn't have any rings, any double bonds, etc., we say that it is fully saturated, right? And so when something's fully saturated, that basically means that it has the maximum number of hydrogens present in the molecule. And so the general structure for the formula that we have for a saturated alkane is CnH2n plus 2, where N basically defines the number of carbons that are present in that molecule. So for example, if I'm showing these two structures here, we see that both of these are examples of alkanes because they have no double bonds present. And we see that they are fully saturated because they don't have any double bonds and they don't have any rings. If a compound were to introduce a degree of unsaturation, abbreviated DOU, basically what that means is that you have now introduced in some form of a double bond or some form of a pi system, as well as the possibility of introducing in a ring. So every time that you introduce in a degree of unsaturation, whether it be a double bond or a ring, what you've done is you've actually reduced the molecule by 2 hydrogens. So in this formula that we had from before, CnH2n plus 2, every time you introduce a double bond or a ring or a triple bond, etc., what you've done is you've eliminated 2 hydrogens from this generic formula. So sometimes it's confusing to students if they were to see something like a ring with a couple different double bonds in them. You count each degree of unsaturation separately. So let's say, for instance, I'm going to add in a whiteboard so we can kind of practice this idea. Let's say that I were to give you a structure that has a ring. And in this ring, what I'm going to do is add in a couple different double bonds. So in this example here, if I were to count the degrees of unsaturation, I have a total of 3 degrees of unsaturation. Why is that? The ring represents 1 degree, and each double bond represents another degree of unsaturation. So I have 1 for the ring, 1 for this double bond, and 1 for this double bond here. So a total of 3 degrees of unsaturation for this structure. All right, so I'm going to have you guys kind of participate and throw in the chat. For this next structure that I draw, how many degrees of unsaturation do you think are present? Go ahead and throw in this chat for me. How many degrees of unsaturation are present? Great, I got a lot of responses here. So that is correct. We have 4 degrees of unsaturation present. How is that so? This triple bond here gives us 2 degrees of unsaturation. This double bond is an additional degree of unsaturation. And then lastly, this ring here has 1 more degree of unsaturation. So this structure here has total 4 degrees of unsaturation. How many hydrogens will we expect to be deducted from the ideal formula for an alkane? Because we have 4 degrees of unsaturation. That's correct. So there should be 8 hydrogens that are removed from that ideal formula of CnH2n plus 2, because each degree of unsaturation means that we've lost 2 hydrogens. So great job. Thanks, guys. Okay, so let's kind of continue with this idea. I know that you probably have seen that there are many different formulas for how you can calculate degrees of unsaturation. So the formula that I'm going to show to you here today is a fail-proof formula, basically meaning, let's say that you forgot everything that you learned in your 3 quarters of organic chemistry, but you do remember that the alkane, if it's fully saturated, has this 2n plus 2 formula, right? So we already see that present here and our formula for the degrees of unsaturation. Basically, what we're going to do now is we're going to subtract out X and we're going to divide this by 2. What does the X represent here? The X represents basically the number of hydrogens that we have present in our molecular formula. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take that 2n plus 2, which is representative of a fully saturated alkane, subtract out the number of hydrogens we have present in our molecular formula, and we're going to divide that by 2. That's going to tell us the degrees of unsaturation. Because in the examples that I showed you a couple seconds ago, what we had were actual structures. You may not always get a structure in your passage on the MCAT. What you may get instead is just a molecular formula. So let's kind of practice that a little bit. Let's say that we have C6H6. The first blank here is going to represent the number of carbons that we have present in our structure. So I'm going to put 6 here. And the second blank here represents the number of hydrogens that I have present. So we're going to put a 6 here. So based on this formula, how many degrees of unsaturation would we expect for something that is C6H6? Go ahead and throw it in the chat for me. How many degrees of unsaturation would we expect for a formula that has C6H6? All right, perfect. 4 degrees of unsaturation. So let's say that even with this formula, you still forget. You forget the formula. What is a foolproof way of being able to calculate the degrees of unsaturation? Remember we said that the ideal formula is CnH2n plus 2, right? So if, let's say, a compound has 6 total carbons in it, how many hydrogens would we expect if it were fully saturated? So if a compound has 6 hydrogens present, 6 carbons present, and it's fully saturated, how many hydrogens would we expect? Perfect. So we would expect 14 hydrogens total to be in a fully saturated alkane. So the formula that was actually given is C6H6. So if I basically subtract the ideal from what I was given, I see that I have a deficit of 8 hydrogens. And remember that for every 2 hydrogens, you have 1 degree of unsaturation. So if I divide this by 2, what this basically tells me is that I have 4 degrees of unsaturation, which is what you calculated using this formula. So basically what I've given you is 2 different scenarios here of being able to calculate degrees of unsaturation, because oftentimes you have a lot of different formulas that you're being asked to memorize on the MCAT, and I don't want you to forget, really easy problem. So let's say, for instance, that moving away from just having carbons and hydrogens, so having a hydrocarbon, we actually now have halogens or oxygens or nitrogens present in our formula. What we do with halogens is we treat them like they're hydrogens. So you would tack that on to X. With oxygens, we basically ignore them because with oxygens, they are divalent compounds and they aren't going to have any contribution in this degree of unsaturation formula. And then lastly, with nitrogens, what we basically do is we're going to subtract the number of nitrogens from X. So for instance, if my formula had 1 hydrogen and 7 halogens, what I would be including for X would be 8. If my formula had 6 halogens and 1 nitrogen, what I would be including is subtracting that 1 nitrogen from whatever my X term was. So let's kind of go ahead and practice this scenario. I'm going to start off with this formula here. Give you guys a quick second to go ahead and calculate it. And once you have determined the degrees of unsaturation, go ahead and throw it in the chat for me. Okay, perfect. I see 2 answers kind of popping up. I'm going to wait a little bit longer for others to throw in some answers in the chat. Okay, perfect. So we got 2 degrees of unsaturation. Let's see how we calculated that. So in this particular formula, we see that we have 5 carbons. So I'm going to put a 5 here for N. And I see that I have 5 hydrogens and 3 halogens. So in total, I sum my hydrogens and halogens, which gives me an 8 here for X. And so here, if I were to do order of operations for my numerator, I get a 4, divide that 4 by 2, and that means that I have 2 degrees of unsaturation for this problem. Let's look at our second scenario here. Go ahead and solve it for me and throw your answer in the chat when you've gotten a chance. All right, perfect. We had a couple answers here. So once again, we have 6 carbons. So I'm putting 6 in for my first blank. And I have 12 hydrogens. We know that oxygens are divalent compounds. So I am not going to be including them in my formula. So instead, I'm just going to write the 12 for the number of hydrogens I have present. My numerator is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So I have 1 degree of unsaturation. All right, let's try our very last example here. When you've received your answer, go ahead and throw it in the chat for me so I know that you're ready for me to move on. All right, so I got a couple answers. Anyone else? All right, cool. So we got 3 as our degrees of unsaturation. Let's look at it. So we have a total of 10 carbons. So 10 will be my first blank. And for my second blank, I know that oxygens are divalent, so I won't be including them. And I have 17 hydrogens here, 1 nitrogen. Remember, we subtract our number of nitrogens from our X term. So I'm going to be subtracting 1 from 17, meaning that my X term is 16. So my numerator here is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So that means I have 3 degrees of unsaturation for this last formula. All right, are there any questions for me before we move on? If you do have a question, using your participants window, give me a check so that I know that you are typing. If not, you don't have to do anything. All right, so seeing no questions, what we're going to do is we're going to continue to move on. Okay, so what we like to do with any chemical formula, or any chemical reaction, is to take a look at some properties of the molecules in which we're going to be reacting. Oftentimes on the MCAT, what you will have is, if you were to break it down, something as simple as what is unstable and what is stable, right? Ideally, every unstable molecule wants to be stable, so it will orient itself in such a way to become stable. Let's talk about some properties that we would expect an unstable molecule to have. So we would expect an unstable molecule to be pretty high in energy. We would expect it to be fairly reactive. And we would also expect, because it's so reactive, for it to react almost immediately in solution. And so as a result, it has a much shorter lifetime. And so properties of a stable molecule essentially tend to be the opposite of what we'd expect for an unstable molecule. We'd expect a stable molecule to be very low in energy. And as a result of being very low in energy, we'd expect it to not be as reactive whenever it's in solution. It has no reason to react because it's pretty stable in its conformation. And then lastly, because it's so stable and it's not going to be as reactive, we'd expect it to stick stick around a lot longer in solution. So it'd have a much longer lifetime. So essentially what we will do in any of the scenarios that we have in OChem is we will try to introduce in scenarios that either influence the molecule stability or instability to provoke a reaction. And what that essentially does is it allows for structural or even electronic changes to occur. And ideally, as I mentioned before, we want molecules to be stable. So anything that will allow it to lower its overall energy to become more stable is essentially something that is good. So let's talk about ways that we can make molecules be more stable. The first thing is to kind of essentially look at this idea of ring strain. So when we talk about an ideal bond angle, remember something having this tetrahedral configuration, sp3 hybridized, the bond angle associated with that is 109.5. But if we introduce in something like a 3-membered ring, this 3-membered ring has a substantial amount of ring strain. Why is that? Because the bond angle in a 3-membered ring is 60 degrees, and that's substantially lower than what we want the ideal bond angle to be, 109.5. So as a result, something like a 3-membered ring has a substantial amount of ring strain. And so ring strain matters so much because it destabilizes the ring. It weakens carbon-carbon bonds. And overall, this 3-membered ring will try to do whatever it can to alleviate some of that ring strain. So in other words, this 3-membered ring is very reactive. So the amount of ring strain associated with the 3-membered ring, we would expect to be about 27.6 kilocalories per mole. So that just kind of gives you a quantitative number to associate with the amount of ring strain we'd expect for a 6-membered ring. Now, you do not have to memorize that for the MCAT. It's just to kind of give you an idea of what I mean when I say ring strain. Let's look at what happens with a 4-membered ring. So we know that with this 4-membered ring, each bond angle in here is about 90 degrees. But even still, this 4-membered ring has a much lower bond angle than the ideal bond angle, which is 109.5. So there is still a pretty significant amount of ring strain present. We see that it's a little bit lower than the 3-membered ring, so it's 26.4 kcals per mole, but still a significant amount of ring strain. However, here, if we were to introduce in a 6-membered ring, and in this 6-membered ring, we actually have the ideal bond angle of 109.5. Whenever we try to basically convert this into a hydrocarbon, so not a cyclic ring, but just a six carbon hydrocarbon, we see that there's no reaction that occurs. And the reason for that is because this 6-membered ring in its state already has the ideal bond angle, and it's a pretty stable molecule. So it does not need to destabilize itself, or it doesn't need to be reactive in order to reduce any type of ring strain. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're moving forward. When you get different molecules, you can kind of predict which ones are going to be the more reactive ones based on ring strain. 6-membered rings and 5-membered rings kind of being more stable, 3 and 4-membered rings being highly reactive because they're so much lower than the ideal bond angle. All right. Another contributing factor to determine if something's going to be stable or not is going to be induction. And so when I talk about induction, essentially what I'm referring to is the sharing or the shifting of electrons in a sigma bond. Sigma bond, single bond, I'll use those two terms interchangeably. And so what we tend to see for induction is that it's heavily dependent on electronegativity. And so just as a refresher, because I'm not sure whether or not you guys have seen any of the GChem lectures or not, but electronegativity is basically the want or the pull of a given compound to wanting to obtain more electrons. And so we know that fluorine is our most electronegative element on the periodic table. What we tend to see with induction is that electrons in that single bond or sigma bond will try to shift towards the more electronegative element, all in an effort to be more stable. So when I talk about a molecule that is electronegative and this concept of electron density, will we expect a electronegative element or substituent to want to withdraw electronegativity, meaning we want it to kind of pull it towards itself, or we would expect it to donate it, meaning push it away from itself? What would we expect for an electronegative element? To withdraw, meaning to pull it closer to itself, or to donate, meaning pushing it further away from itself? Exactly. We would expect that electronegative element to withdraw electron density, meaning to pull it from whatever source it's by it and pull it towards itself. Examples of electronegative substituents include oxygens, halogens, etc. And what we tend to see for these electronegative substituents is that a lot of times they have a large number of free electron pairs. And they're closer to the more electronegative element on the periodic table, which is fluorine, which is one of our halogens. And so as a result, electropositive substituents do the exact opposite, right? They donate electron density. They're going to be pushing it away from themselves. Examples of electropositive substituents include alkyl groups. So anytime you see like any of those R groups or carbon groups, those are going to be the type of groups that we'd expect to push electron density away from themselves. All right, so let's kind of look at why or how induction matters so much when we look at groups like carbocations. And we will talk about carboanions in a second, but carbocations tend to be more stable than our carboanions. Let's talk about how the presence of electronegative or electropositive groups influences how stable a carbocation will be. So as I just mentioned, these R groups are electropositive, meaning they are going to donate electron density. When we talk about a molecule being stable, ideally a stable molecule is something that tends to be neutral. And so with a carbocation, we have a positive charge here on our central atom. What we want is our overall compound to feel less of the effect of that positive charge. So what are ways that we can reduce the feel of this positive charge? Our groups are going to donate electron density. If I donate electron density towards something that is positive, am I becoming more neutral? Yes or no? If I donate electron density, which is negatively charged, towards something that is positively charged, am I becoming more neutral? Yes, I am. So when we look at these carbocations, what we tend to see is that the more R groups you have present, the more stable the overall compound is. Why is that? Because each one of these R groups is contributing electron density, negative electron density, towards a positively charged carbon center. So the trend that we see for each one of these carbocations is that the tertiary carbocation is more stable than the secondary carbocation, which is more stable than the primary, which is more stable than the methyl group. And so with this methyl group, what we have is just hydrogens present. These hydrogens are still contributing electron density, but certainly not as much as our R groups. Any questions on how we deduce this trend for the carbocations? If you have a question, give me a yes and go ahead and type your question. If not, give me a no so I know to move on. Okay. Let's look at how this kind of flips for carboanions. So as I mentioned, carbocations are more stable than our carboanions, but let's look at what happens with the carboanions. So as we already know, these R groups are electropositive. They are donating electron density. If I have 3 R groups and I'm donating electron density towards something that is already negative, am I becoming more stable or less stable? Exactly. I'm becoming less stable because I'm creating more of a charged compound. I'm pushing electron density, negative electron density, towards something that is already negative. So what we see for carboanions is this trend with the R groups actually flips. Whereas our methyl groups are our more stable compounds and our tertiary groups tend to be our less stable compounds. So the trend flips. Okay. Any questions about that concept? So this idea of tertiary carbocations will kind of haunt you throughout majority of the problems that we discuss with organic chemistry, because ideally what we want is a more stable compound overall. And so if you introduce in or create a carbocation, ideally you want that carbocation to be more substituted with these R groups. Okay, so at this point, we talked about ring strain, we talked about induction. Let's talk about one other contributing factor to stability, and that is resonance. And so unlike induction, which is the sharing or the shifting of electron density through sigma bonds, what resonance basically is the sharing of electron density via delocalized pi bonds. So what happens with resonance is that what we can do is begin to stabilize our molecule. Why is that? Because with resonance, what we do is we delocalize the electrons, or we delocalize that charge and kind of distribute the charge throughout the molecule. And so when I'm talking about delocalization of electrons, basically what I'm talking about is just spreading out that electron density amongst multiple atoms. So that way no one atom feels the bulk of that charge. All right, so let's look at an example here. Let's say that we have an allylic bromide. What that basically means is that the bromine is allylic to the double bond. So one carbon off from where the double bond is. It's the atom that's adjacent to the pi bond. This particular structure, if we were to remove that bromine, could create a resonance structure. And so how do we know this? Well, resonance basically is going to occur whenever you have a positive or negative charge, or even a lone pair that's going to be adjacent to that pi bond. So let's talk about what happens here when I kick that bromine off. Whenever I kick this bromine off, what I've done now is the electrons that were in this bond to the bromine are now shifted on towards the bromine. So we have a negatively charged bromine here as our product. And what I'm left with is a carbon here that no longer has those shared electrons. And so as a result, it is positively charged. What we created is an allylic cation. And so by creating this allylic cation, what we've done is we've introduced in a charge that is basically allylic to that double bond. And so as a result, we have the possibility for resonance being able to occur. And so the possible resonance structure that we can create is this double bond that we have here can actually shift to the adjacent carbon to try to get rid of that positively charged carbon. And what we do is we shift the positive charge from carbon 3 to carbon 1. And so what both of these are resonance structures of each other, because you can interchangeably go back and forth. And so what we've also created is a resonance hybrid. And so with this resonance hybrid, what happens is this electron density in the double bond is actually shared or distributed amongst both carbons. And so this is showing here that distribution of the electron density within those pi bonds. And with our resonance hybrid, what we have basically is a shared combination of each one of the contributors. And as a result, what we have is a partial charge on carbon 1 and a partial charge on carbon 3. Overall, by creating resonance structures, what we created is a more stable molecule overall. Okay, so there are some rules that we have with resonance. You can't just have resonance for any given structure. One of the major rules that we need is that delocalization, or the ability to even perform resonance, you have to have adjacent p orbitals. What I basically mean by that is there has to be this idea of alternating single and double bonds, meaning you have to have sp2 hybridized molecules. You cannot have something that's sp3 hybridized, because that will not allow for resonance to occur. You would exceed the octet rule for carbon. You would have too many bonds to carbon. The most stable resonance structure, of course, is going to be the one that contributes the most to that hybrid resonance hybrid that I just talked about. And as I also mentioned, the more resonance structures a molecule will have, the greater it will be, or the greater the more stable it will be. So major resonance structures, the ones that are going to contribute the most to the resonance hybrid, they have some really important rules that are always mentioned and are always followed. And I'm writing them in the order of importance. The first is that the octet rule is always satisfied. That is by far the most important rule. The second is that you want to have the resonance structure that has the least amount of formal charge. And so with formal charge, basically what I'm talking about is like a positive or a negative charge on any one of your given compound elements. And if there is formal charge in your molecule, let's say that we drew 5 possible resonance structures, we're trying to figure out which one of these is contributing the most to the hybrid. You want to pick the resonance structure that minimizes the charge separation, right? So the idea of being able to cluster your charge together is better overall for resonance structures. So if all of your resonance structures have formal charge, you want to minimize charge separation. But if there is a resonance structure that doesn't have any formal charge, that's going to be, of course, the one that is going to be the major resonance structure. And then lastly, as I mentioned, if you do have resonance structures and all of them have formal charge on them, not only do we want to minimize charge separation, but we're going to make sure that we put negative charge on the more electronegative element. Why is that? Because that more electronegative element can actually sustain and support that negative charge. Because remember, electronegative elements, they withdraw electron density. They want to pull that electron density towards themselves. All right, any questions on these first three rules? If you have a question, write yes and go ahead and type your question in the chat. Otherwise, give me a no so I know to move on. Okay, cool, cool, cool. All right, so let's look at some examples here of resonance structures. So here we have this molecule here that has three possible resonance structures. Let's talk about how we could actually make each of these three resonance structures. So the first structure here, what I could basically do is I could take this lone pair that's on this oxygen, and I could actually push it towards the nitrogen-oxygen bond to create a double bond. And now what I essentially have is too many bonds to my nitrogen. So what I could essentially do is push the electron density that's in this pi bond up onto the oxygen. And so as a result, what I've done is created a resonance structure where now the double bond is between the nitrogen and the oxygen on the right, as opposed to the oxygen and the nitrogen on the left. Another way to create the third resonance structure is I could actually get the ring involved. And so what I could basically do is take the lone pair on my oxygen down here at the bottom, use that to create a double bond between this oxygen and the carbon that's in our ring. And I could disturb the ring aromaticity by basically moving this pi system and just kind of moving the bonds within this pi system. I have to continue here because what I would have is too many bonds to carbon. So what I could essentially do is take this double bond present here and create a double bond from carbon to nitrogen to alleviate me having too many bonds to my carbon. And then lastly, what I could do is I could push the electron density between the nitrogen and oxygen up onto the oxygen. And so what I've done as a result is I've created this third resonance structure here. Now what I need to ask myself is, based on these three different resonance structures, which ones are the major ones and which ones are the minor ones? So let's say, for instance, I label these A, B, and C. What I want you to do for me is to throw in the chat which one or ones you feel are our major resonance structure or structures. All right, cool, cool. So I see in the chat that a couple people think A and B. That is absolutely correct. A and B are our two major resonance structures. C is our minor resonance structure, and let's talk about why. Why do we think that C is our minor resonance structure? What's wrong with C? Any takers? Throw in the chat. What do we think is wrong with resonance structure C? Right, I agree. So resonance structure C compared to A and B has an abundance of formal charge, right? And we want to, based on our rules up here, pick the resonance structures that have the least amount of formal charge. And remember, I also mentioned too that we want to minimize charge separation. In resonance structure C, not only do I have more formal charge, but I have a resonance structure that has formal charge at the top and the bottom of that resonance structure. Someone also mentioned more charges. Yes, that's correct. So the same idea of having way too many charges on our molecule. Why is A and B equivalent? Does anyone have an idea why A and B are equivalent resonance structures? Yeah, our oxygens here are symmetrical. The nitrogen can't differentiate between one or the other. The only way that it would be able to differentiate between one or the other is if we, instead of this being oxygen 16, made it something else, like an oxygen 17, so forth and so on, like an isotope. So as a result, both of these resonance structures, A and B, they have the same amount of formal charge. The formal charge is still placed on the same elements, and so as a result, A and B are equivalent resonance structures. So any of these would be equivalent answers for the MCAT. All right, any questions for me on resonance? If you have a question, write yes and go ahead and start typing your question. If not, give me a no so I know it's okay for me to move on. Okay. All right, so quiz time. What I'm going to do is give you guys a couple scenarios here. And what I want you to do is just basically tell me whether structure A or structure B is the major contributor for resonance. Kind of keeping in mind those rules that we mentioned before. And just as a refresher, our rules in the order of importance were: one, octet rule has to be satisfied. Two, you want to pick the structure with the least amount of formal charge. And three, if we do have formal charge, we want to make sure that the formal charge isn't separated on the molecule and that the negative charge is always placed on the more electronegative element. So I'm going to give you guys a second to kind of look at these two structures and give me your opinion of which one you think is the major contributor here in the chat, A or B. All right, so we got an outstanding A answer. That is correct. Why is A the major contributor? What are we thinking here? Anyone have any ideas why we would have picked A? Yes, I agree. So A has the least amount of formal charge. Our octet rule is satisfied, so we moved on to B. B is saying that we want to pick the structure with the least amount of formal charge. So scenario A here is the correct answer. All right, let's look at our second scenario here. A or B, which one is going to be our major resonance structure? Haha, you guys took the bait. That's incorrect. The correct answer here is A. Now, having told you that A is the correct answer, why would A be right? It makes no sense. It completely went against what I just said about the formal charge rule. What happens with A? That's correct. So in the second scenario, I don't have a full octet for carbon. So let's look on the left-hand side, right? We want to have those 8 electrons for carbon. I have 1, 2, and in this triple bond system, I have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So carbon here has 8 electrons, the oxygen 2, 4, 6, 7, 8. So both the carbon and the oxygen here have a full octet. If I go and look at option B, the carbon here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That carbon does not have a full octet. The most important rule for resonance in determining what is your major resonance contributor is you have to have a full octet. So option B here does not meet that criteria. All right, and let's look at our last scenario here. Option A or option B for what is our major resonance structure? Go ahead and throw it in the chat for me. What do you think? Okay, I see Laura's answered. Anyone else? What do we think? Got to build you guys morale back from the last one. All right, so I see a couple B's. That is correct. B is the correct answer. Why is B our major contributor for the resonance structure? What does B have that we like? Right, the charge is on the more electronegative element. So we look at carbon and oxygen. Oxygen here is going to be closer to that fluorine atom, fluorine being our most electronegative element on the periodic table. So as a result, option C, why do I keep saying option C? Option B is our our larger contributor for our resonance structure. Okay, any questions for me for these 3 different scenarios? If you have any questions, write yes, and then go ahead and type your question in the chat. Otherwise, give me a no so I know I can keep going. Okay. Okay, so now that we have kind of practiced this idea of resonance structures in a couple different scenarios, what I want to do now is kind of shift this towards the way that you would see this on the MCAT. So this would be more of an MCAT style question. What we would be asked to do is not just, out of option A or B, pick what is the more contributing resonance structure. Instead, what we'd be asked is, okay, which one is the more stable compound, taking resonance into account. So I'm going to give you guys a quick second to look over these 3 Roman numerals. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes to kind of answer that in your head. And what we'll do is kind of go over it. So I'm giving you 2 minutes to look at each one of these and basically come up with the ranking. And while we're doing this, if anyone has any questions for me, feel free to throw them in the chat. If you're a little nervous about asking them, feel free to shoot me a question privately. And I see we already have some answers kind of popping in the chat. So about 1 more minute for kind of attempting this. When you feel comfortable, go ahead and throw it in the chat, whatever you think the answer is. Okay, so formal charge, when we're talking about that, is basically you applying a positive or a negative charge to any given element. So basically what that means is if you go based on valence, for instance, so let's say that we're talking about a nitrogen. A nitrogen has a valence of 5 on the periodic table. And so if I look at the number of bonds to that nitrogen, let's say that it has a total of 6 contributing electrons, that's 1 over what it needed to have its valence. And so what I would basically do is do 5 minus 6. That gives me a -1 on the nitrogen. Let's say that nitrogen has a valence of 5 and I have 4 contributing electrons through my bonds and through lone pairs. So what I would do is 5 minus 4. That would mean the nitrogen has a +1 charge. So basically what that means is I'm deviating from my valence, the number of electrons I need for my valence. And so as a result, I'm adding a positive or a negative charge to the element that deviates from the number of electrons it needs for its valence. So in regards to formal charge, Lillian, if we look at Roman numeral 1, I see formal charge being present on this carbon. In Roman numeral 2, I see formal charge here. And in Roman numeral 3, I see formal charge here, all being a +1 formal charge. All right, so I see a couple different answer choices in the chat, B and D. So the way that we try to do ranking style questions on the MCAT is you want to find the option that is the most and the least applicable to the question. So here I'm looking for ranking in order of increasing stability. I want to find the compound that is the most stable, and I want to find the compound that is the least stable to help me eliminate answer choices. For me, my mind kind of thinks of what is most wrong. So I tend to do these in the order of what is my least stable compound? What is the one that does not meet the criteria that I want? If we look at Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3, what is my least stable compound? Like which one does not work for me? All right, so I got a vote for 3. Anyone else? Vote for 1. Anyone else? Anyone want to break the tie here? 1 and 3. All right, well, I'll break the tie. The least stable structure we have here is actually Roman numeral 1. And the reason why Roman numeral 1 is the least stable is because I can't do resonance. So remember, for resonance, I need that alternating single double bond character, or having this sp2 hybridized environment. I have this double bond present here, which is fine. The issue is I can't move it anywhere. And the reason for that is because if I look at this carbon right here, this carbon has what type of hybridization? SP2 or SP3? It is SP3 hybridized. So just a quick refresher, how do I know it's SP3 hybridized? On this carbon, I have 2 hydrogens present. So let's say this bond is S, P1, P2, P3. So this carbon is SP3 hybridized. I need my carbons to be SP2 hybridized in order for me to participate in resonance. And the more resonance structures I have, the more stable I am. So if Roman numeral 1 can't participate in any resonance, then it is not the most stable. So if Roman numeral 1 is the least stable, what answer choices can I eliminate because it doesn't show Roman numeral 1 as being the least stable? Right. I can already eliminate 2 answer choices as a result of identifying which Roman numeral did not work. So now I'm left with Roman numeral 2 and Roman numeral 3 for identifying now which one here is the most stable. Let's look at essentially what's happening here for Roman numeral 2 and Roman numeral 3. So with Roman numeral 2, I see that I have this positively charged carbon here. What that basically means is I have 1 hydrogen present. And so as a result, this is sp1, p2 hybridized. So I could actually move this double bond to this carbon here. And when I do so, I create the resonance structure that I'm drawing now. Okay. Let's look at Roman numeral 3 to kind of compare its possible resonance structure. Same scenario. So if I look at this carbon, I have a positive charge here, which basically means that I have only 1 hydrogen here, not 2. And I have sp1, p2 hybridization at this particular carbon. What I could essentially do is move and shift this double bond character from carbon 1 to now between carbon 2 and 3. The resonance structure that I now draw looks like this. Okay, so what I result in having are 2 carbocations. Remember, we talked about which types of carbocations are the most stable. Do we want our carbocations to be more substituted or less substituted? Right, we want our carbocations to be more substituted. Why is that? Because remember, we said that our groups, they contribute negative electron density. So if I'm contributing negative electron density towards something that is positive, essentially what I've done is I've tried to neutralize more of that structure. So Roman numeral 2 in my resonance structure creates a tertiary carbocation. Roman numeral 3 creates, in my new resonance structure, a primary carbocation. So as a result, Roman numeral 2 is more stable. Roman numeral 2, as a result, is going to be my most stable resonance structure. So in my ranking, that means that answer choice B is my correct answer. Any questions on how we went about kind of comparing the stability of these molecules? If you have a question, write yes, throw it in the chat for me. If not, give me a no, so I know it's okay for me to move on. Okay. All right. So now that we've kind of gone through that, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how now we can use both induction and resonance to kind of talk about not only this idea of stability, but now this idea of acidity and how it influences organic functional compounds or groups. So on the MCAT, you'll see Bronsted-Lowry acids, you'll see Lewis acids, et cetera, be used. But specifically for today, what I'm going to be talking about are these Bronsted-Lowry acids. And so the traditional definition for Bronsted-Lowry acid is that it donates a proton. And when it does, after it donates the proton, what you get as a result for the product is a conjugate base. The idea is if I were to donate this proton and I produce a product, I'm only going to donate the proton if I'm going to end up being better off after it's been donated. Meaning, I'm only going to donate this proton if, as a result, what I make is actually stable. I'm not going to give you something if I'm going to be worse off. So that's essentially what happens with these Bronsted-Lowry acids. And we can use this idea as a way to predict how acidic a compound is. The more stable that conjugate base is once the proton has been donated, the more acidic the acid was that donated that proton. There are actually 3 different things that we use to basically determine how stable the conjugate base will be and essentially how acidic the acid was. The first is looking at electronegativity. We already know that electronegative atoms, they handle that negative charge better, essentially. So that's why when we talked about with resonance, we said that if we do have a negative formal charge on our structure, we want to make sure that the electronegative elements get that negative charge because they can handle it a lot better. They want the negative charge. So here, what we're looking at too is once we generate this conjugate base, which one of these conjugate bases can have and stabilize that negative charge the best. So let's look at an example here with the alkane. And so with the alkane, what we've done is we've highlighted in red the acidic proton, meaning the proton that I'm going to give away. When I give that proton away, the structure that I create here is this carboanion, where I have a negative charge being placed now on my carbon. If I have an amine, what I would do is donate the acidic hydrogen in red, and I would be left with a negative charge on my nitrogen. And then lastly, if I have an alcohol, I would donate the acidic hydrogen in red and be left with a negative charge on my oxygen. Out of a carbon, nitrogen, and an oxygen, which one is our most electronegative element? Right, the oxygen is the more electronegative element. And so as a result, this oxygen can best stabilize that negative charge once the hydrogen leaves. And as a result, the oxygen or the compound that contains that oxygen is going to be the more acidic compound. So as a result, our alcohol here is the most acidic. Our least electronegative element was the carbon here. And as a result, the alkane tends to be the least acidic compound. So all we're doing when we try to determine acidity is we take off the hydrogen or the most acidic hydrogen, and we look at how stable was the molecule once the hydrogen left. If the molecule is very stable once the hydrogen's left, then we say that that molecule or the compound that it came from is our most acidic compound. All right, any questions on how we use electronegativity to determine acidity? If you have a question, write yes, throw it in the chat. Otherwise, give me a no so I can move on. Okay. The second idea is with resonance. So we had already talked about how acidity can be predicted using electronegativity. Let's talk about how it can be predicted using resonance. We know that the more resonant structures a compound has, the more stable it will be. So we have a compound that has an acidic hydrogen on it, and once that hydrogen leaves, we can actually perform resonance. Well, that compound is going to actually be pretty stable. So here's an example here where we have this carbonyl structure, more specifically it's the carboxylic acid, and we denote here where our acidic hydrogen is. It's this hydrogen here that's attached to the oxygen. If this hydrogen leaves or is subtracted by a base, etc., what we're left with is a negative charge on our oxygen. We know that beyond the oxygen being able to handle that negative charge, this structure can actually also participate in resonance. This is an example of that resonance structure. So the lone pair that's on this oxygen here can actually participate in the formation of a double bond, and the electron density in this pi system can be pushed up onto the oxygen to create a new electron pair. As a result, what I've done is created a resonance structure. The ability to create a resonance structure means that my original compound is pretty stable. So this carboxylic acid here is actually pretty acidic. It has a pKa of around 4. And depending on what it's bound to, it can be ranged anywhere from 2 to 4. And as a result, it's a pretty acidic compound, and resonance helps with that acidity. And so our third and last contributing factor here that we look at for acidity is induction. And so remember, we talked about induction being the shifting of the electron density amongst sigma bonds or single bonds. And so with induction, as we're talking about the shifting of electron pairs throughout sigma bonds, what we're going to be looking at is what's attached to the compound to help influence its stability once the hydrogen leaves. And that's going to be based on not only the proximity, but also the electronegativity of WG stands for electron withdrawing groups. So let's look at a couple scenarios here, right? We have 4 different compounds, and each one of these 4 different compounds is unique. What we would essentially want to do is basically rank these based on their acidity. The way that you go about ranking these, of course, is to first look at how stable is your conjugate base once the hydrogen has left. So what I'm going to do is basically kind of predict what happens when the hydrogen leaves. So what I would be left with is a negative charge on the oxygens for each one of these structures. I'm basically doing is drawing the resulting conjugate base whenever these acids participate in acid-base chemistry. Okay, I have a negative charge on my oxygen. The oxygen can certainly stabilize that negative charge. I have resonance potentially that's also helping with stabilization, but I also have some other contributing factors here. I have electron withdrawing groups present on these structures. If I have a negative charge on my overall compound, what I want my structure to feel is more neutral. Through induction, what I could do with these electron withdrawing groups is actually withdraw some of that negative electron density from the oxygen towards more of these electron withdrawing groups or these halogens. So basically the oxygen feels less of that negative character. It doesn't have to pull it by itself. Would I want more electron withdrawing groups or less with electron withdrawing groups in order for my oxygen to feel more stable? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. Would I want more electron withdrawing groups or less of them? I agree. I would want more of them. So the more electron withdrawing groups I have, the more I would be able to pull that electron density from the oxygen towards each one of these fluorine atoms. And what that allows me to do is to have my oxygen feel more neutral. So on structure 1, I have 3 fluorines. Structure 2, I have 2 fluorines. Structure 3, I have 1 fluorine. And on structure 4, I have a chlorine. Which one is more electronegative, a fluorine or a chlorine? The fluorine. So as a result, what my trend tends to be is structure 1 is more stable because I have 3 very electronegative groups helping to withdraw the electron density from the oxygen towards themselves. And my least electronegative element is the chlorine. And so as a result, it will still be pulling that electron density from the oxygen, but it won't be pulling it as well as the fluorine. So because my first structure generates my most stable conjugate base, as a result, if I were to look at the acid form, it is structure 1 that is my most stable or most acidic acid. All right, any questions on how we did that for induction? Okay, If not, then I'm going to keep going and kind of wrap up with this last section because I don't want to run over the time that has been allotted to me. Let's talk about just kind of like the fundamentals now for any given organic mechanism that we'll go over. And that deals with nucleophiles, electrophiles, and leaving groups. So when I'm talking about a nucleophile, essentially what I'm talking about is something that is nucleus loving, meaning nucleus loving, so it's filled with an abundance of protons, is abbreviated NU with this negative charge on it. That negative charge is really important. The reason for it is because we're trying to indicate here that nucleophiles tend to be electron rich. So they usually have a full or a partial negative charge. They have an abundance of electrons oftentimes, so as a result, they can donate a pair of electrons. And when they donate that pair of electrons, what we tend to do is the nucleophile will attack something and then form a new covalent bond. Another name for a nucleophile that you will see on the MCAT is a Lewis base, and they tend to use these terms interchangeably. So if you see nucleophile and Lewis base, be very cognizant that those are the same thing, and the MCAT will never give you two right answers. So go ahead and cross both of them out. So examples of nucleophiles, they include alkenes. So alkenes have delocalized electrons. You could have a hydroxide. A hydroxide molecule has this negative charge, an abundance of electrons on an oxygen. Ammonia is an example of a fairly weak nucleophile, but still a nucleophile nonetheless, because it does have this lone pair on the nitrogen. You could have a nitrile. You have that triple bond in between the carbon nitrogen and the lone pair on that nitrogen. And then another example could be your halogen, right? So an abundance of lone pairs that can participate in various mechanisms. Let's kind of look at, let's say we're given water, hydroxide, ammonia, and NH2, which ones would be our weaker and stronger nucleophiles? Ways that you can use, or techniques you can use to kind of rank nucleophilicity is first by looking at its overall charge, right? So if I have a formal charge being placed, that means I have an abundance of electrons present, meaning I have more electron pairs that I could donate, meaning I am better fulfilling this role of a nucleophile. So as a result, if I look at water, hydroxide, ammonia, and NH2, my stronger nucleophiles are going to be the ones that tend to have the charge on them. So as a result, my hydroxide and my NH2 are going to be stronger than water and ammonia. Then the question becomes, well, how do we rank now between the two sets? We use electronegativity as a way to kind of be able to differentiate between the two sets. What we tend to say is if an element is wanting to act, or a compound is wanting to act as a nucleophile, it needs to be able to donate a pair of electrons. If I'm holding on tight to that pair of electrons, I am less likely to want to donate them. So as a result, the compounds that are the more electronegative, remember electronegative elements wanting to withdraw electron density, pull it towards themselves, a more electronegative element is going to be less likely to want to donate it to something else. And so as a result, more electronegative elements tend to be weaker nucleophiles. So the trend for nucleophilicity basically increases as electronegativity decreases. So if I look at my two sets here, between oxygen and nitrogen, the nitrogen is less electronegative, meaning it is more likely to donate its pair of electrons, meaning it is a stronger nucleophile. So my NH2 is going to be much stronger in its nucleophilicity than my hydroxide. My ammonia is going to be much stronger in its nucleophilicity than water. So as a result, I have this ranking listed here. Water being my weaker nucleophile and my NH2 minus being my stronger nucleophile. All right. And then I'll just wrap up with some nucleophile trends. So let's say, for instance, we have all of our structures being charged. All of them have the same charge on them. How can I then go about ranking my nucleophilicity? The other trend that we're going to use apart from charge and charge is you could use the trend of electronegativity that I just talked about, or you can also use this idea of size, right? So the idea with size for nucleophilicity is that larger atoms, they tend to be more polarizable. So what that basically means is that the electrons, they can conjugate in certain areas of the atom because repulsion allows for it. Basically, the orbital is large enough to account for repulsion in the atom. So basically what that means is that if you're a larger atom, you're more likely to give your electrons away, which basically means that you're acting as a better nucleophile. So as a result, the electrons, they're not as easily distributed within the atom and I can better donate them. So the trend for nucleophilicity, if we go based on size, is that your smaller compounds tend to be weaker nucleophiles and the larger ones tend to be better nucleophiles. All right, any questions for me on any of the content that I covered today? If you have a question, write yes and go ahead and start typing it for me. If not, go ahead and throw your note in the chat for me. Okay, so before I end, I do want to show you, like if this were a Princeton Review class, what some of the passages would look like for OChem. So let me just kind of pull an example up really quickly. We tend to go over to anywhere from 2 to 3 passages in a given lecture. And so this is an example of an OChem style passage. So in this passage, what we're given are some examples of carbocations. And as you can imagine, with them asking about carbocation rearrangements, is we're trying to look at, the ones that are more stable. So we got a whole section here talking about carbocations. We have a mechanism here just kind of showing the movement of the resonance structures to form different variations of carbocations. And then what we would have is questions that range anywhere from like 5 to 6 questions, kind of testing on some of this information. What we tend to see for OChem is that it's not only devoted towards like specific things like carbocation rearrangements, but oftentimes we'll see biology and general chemistry kind of be integrated in some of the OChem passages, right? So in this particular passage, what we're talking about is a terpenoid cyclase that's involved in this cluster, this ligand cluster that you can create. And so what we would want to look at is based on the type of carbocation rearrangement you make, you create different variations of cyclases, and that influences the overall class cyclase ability. And so with any of the given questions, it would refer back to information that you have in the passage. And so for the Princeton Review, what we would do is just kind of map out essentially the style question that you would see, information about what you would want to highlight in the passage, as well as being able to pull out specific information to answer any of these given questions. All right, and so that is all for me. If you have any questions for me, go ahead and throw them in the chat. If not, I'm going to shift it back over to Douglas.
All righty, thank you, Candace or Dr. Ulmer, and appreciate you giving us that little tutorial on some of the energetics involved in organic molecules. That's always a good thing to see, is that's a nice fundamental that you guys are probably getting in your OChem classes, and just help you focus on that if you haven't taken OChem yet. So that would be great. If there's other questions for myself or Dr. Ulmer, please let me know. Otherwise, thank you all for coming this week, or this month, I should say. And remember, our next session is going to be in February. I believe it is the second Saturday in February. Let me check that right quick. Let's see. I'll close my calendar down because it eats bandwidth. So let me get a second to open that up. So the next session will be on February, oops, too far. February, actually, it's going to be earlier than I thought it was going to be. Should be February 6th, yes. So our next session is going to be February 6th. So please do put that one on your calendars. You'll see this video or this recording going up on Facebook and on the Facebook page for MedPrep and on YouTube shortly in about a week or so. So if there's any questions, just let me know, guys. Otherwise, thank you. Have a good weekend.